221. Never left the night watch, turned and left, never expecting to receive an answer. They walked away convinced that some things were fixed: titles, bloodlines, the dignity that people wrap themselves in. For many, lineage is simply a badge of nobility, something to be boasted about without understanding what actually makes a house honorable. That understanding is shallow. Lineage itself is not noble. It is ennobled by deeds and honor. A beggar who achieves immortal feats and rises to be emperor does not literally change his blood, but his name acquires nobility because of what he has done. The beggar's filthy blood still runs in his veins. What changed him was an unbending spirit that refused to accept his place in the world. Soul matters more than blood. Old King Nowick shaped Doom's soul. He was not merely a blood father, he was Doom's soul father, a title that carries far more weight than any genealogical tie. And the bond between Doom and the Emperor was of the same kind. Not kinship by blood, but a shared purpose. It was the Great Crusade to unite humanity. Drawn by the Emperor's grand vision to save all people, Doom, as one of humanity, led the Norworlds into the fight for that future. To the Night Watch, Doom's role in the crusade was never simply a fight for the Imperium. He fought for the unification of all mankind. Alpharius watched them retreat and stood silent for a long moment, surprised at how much he had underestimated them. The warriors from Nur carried free souls and a depth of insight that set them apart. The Astartes, by contrast, cleave to their primarchs. Shaped by bloodlines and by gene seed, they find it difficult to resist their gene fathers and are naturally obedient. That obedience is a blade. It cuts down whatever stands in the Primarch's way. But a blade is double-edged. The same loyalty that slays enemies can also turn inward and wound its wielder. When a Primarch is wise and strong, that obedience is a fearsome weapon. If the Primarch is flawed, the entire legion becomes exposed to grave danger. Watching the Night Watch fade into the distance, Alpharius allowed himself a small smile. His tests had revealed exactly what he wanted to know. As a Primarch who had never left Terra, he had seen this weakness long ago. The Alpha Legion answers to Alpharius, the Luna Wolves to Horus, and the Space Wolves to Russ. The Astartes obey their gene fathers with a devotion that will carry them through fire and flood. That obedience is not law, but loyalty, born of reverence and of the gene seed itself. But what happens if that loyalty is ever tested, if brothers turn against brothers and the sons must choose between their fathers? This is not idle alarmism. Human history keeps repeating the same patterns, and Alpharius saw the danger long before others did. He built his legion to be a shadow force, placing agents inside his brother legions so he could monitor their movements in real time and take the most direct preventive measures. He taught his sons to think for themselves, to judge events from their own perspectives instead of following their Primarch blindly. Primarchs may possess near-divine power, but they are still human minds and therefore fallible. When an ordinary man errs, he can often correct the mistake and the consequences are limited. When a Primarch errs, the mistake is colossal. How can the ruin such an error brings ever be made right? After a stretch of probing, Alpharius felt the pressure ease and abandoned his plan to infiltrate Nur. Within the Destroyer Legion, the eldest son Li Tang was a man of steady judgment. Alpharius had known his character for 10 years. The Night Watch were even more dependable. If Doom decided on a reckless move, they would be the first to object. As for Doom himself, Alpharius wanted to learn more. He walked to the secret chamber. At the door, he found an old acquaintance, Obelisk, though Obelisk did not recognize him in this guise. The giant scrutinized the figure for a long moment. When he judged there was no threat, he and a member of the Night Watch opened the hatch and let him in. Once the panel thunked shut, the guard asked his companion, "Do you know him?" Obelisk's voice came out like a slab of stone. "The Primarch of the 20th Legion, a man who enjoys games of infiltration." "He's not very tall," the guard said, surprised. He'd always imagined Primarchs as towering figures. "He can change his appearance," Obelisk replied curtly, offering his assessment. Alpharius had once matched his brothers for height in the Destroyer Legion. Now he stood no taller than a regular space marine. Aside from a few unusual talents, there was no other explanation. "Imposters are really troublesome," the Night Watch muttered from his post by the door as he carried on with his duty. Alpharius stepped inside, and the door shut behind him. The chamber was bright and spare. His brother was already there, seated in a chair and waiting. "Please, sit, my brother." Doom rose to his feet and with a warm gesture invited the Primarch to take a seat. "Doom Novik?" Alpharius said his brother's name softly as he sat down opposite him, looking up at the taller man. "How did you recognize me?" he asked after a moment, the question that had nagged at him for so long. His disguise had been flawless. Horus, Ferris, Fulgrim, and Saurus had all been fooled, so why had Doom seen through it? Doom poured wine slowly before answering. "I didn't do it on purpose," he said gently. "It was an intuition." He was not lying. It was indeed intuition that had let Doom pick him out again and again in a crowd. "Your intuition frustrates me," Alpharius said with a helpless shrug. He believed Doom. Of course he did. Ordinary mortals had a sense that kept them from stumbling into immediate death. Space Marines had sharper instincts for hidden danger. A Primarch's intuition was on an entirely different level. If Doom had picked up on him, then Doom had really picked up on him. Alpharius sighed and spoke his name. His face shimmered as a curtain of blue psychic light slid across his features, and under its glow, his face began to change, smoothing and rearranging itself into the likeness of someone else. Doom watched, stunned. Then, abruptly, he took a step back. "Wait a moment." He rose and moved away from his sister, away from the transforming figure. "What?" Alpharius asked, baffled. A twitch pulled at the corner of his mouth. The expression looked almost grotesque as he struggled for comprehension. He stood as well, instinctively covering his face with his hand, and retreated to the opposite side of the sparse room. For a few seconds, the two Primarchs simply regarded one another from their corners, each keeping distance. Alpharius kept his hand over his features because he understood why Doom had moved. Doom's presence dampened psychic emanations. Close to him, such powers would still work, but their effectiveness was sharply reduced. By stepping back, Doom had given himself enough space to see the illusion properly. Alpharius covered his face partly to hide the faltering mask now that its power was compromised, and partly because neither of them wanted to stand so close while the other's mind was probing the air between them. Alpharius had just used his transformation ability. At first he felt nothing was wrong, but the effect misfired. His facial features slid out of place. He rubbed his face, glanced at the smooth wall like a mirror, and the reflection brought him back to his usual appearance. "You really are a bit strange," Doom said. Alpharius turned, a complicated expression on his face, and let out a helpless sigh. "Since I learned this talent, I've never made a mistake," he replied, then sank back into his chair and took a rueful sip from his glass. Doom gave an awkward little smile, sat down opposite his brother, and studied him. Alpharius wasn't heroic like Doom, not as wild as Russ, nor as solemn as Saurus. At first he seemed ordinary, yet there was a peculiar charm about him. The more Doom looked, the more extraordinary Alpharius became. "I was only this tall," Alpharius said, pressing Haubra, his hand flat against Doom's chest and indicating a height. "Right up to here on you." Doom's voice was low with genuine admiration. What a perfect disguise, not just altering the face, but changing the whole physique. Alpharius smiled with quiet pride. "I'm very pleased with the talent Father gave me. You're the only brother who's ever seen through me." Aside from Doom, no other Primarch had ever discovered him. It was something to take pride in. If Alpharius had wanted to kill, he would have been the deadliest assassin. Doom raised his glass, tapped it against his brother's, and drank. "When did you return to the Imperium?" he asked, curious. He'd learned of Alpharius from the Destroyer Warrior, but had no idea exactly when his brother had come back. Alpharius' lips curled into a smile. "Return?" Alpharius shook his head slowly and regarded his blood brother with a faint, almost boastful smile. "I never left Terra," he said. "The warp storm scattered you across the galaxy," he continued, "but I fell on the wasteland of Terra. When I opened my eyes, the Emperor himself lifted me from the sand. My memories begin from that moment." As he spoke, Alpharius watched Doom closely, savoring every flicker of surprise that crossed his face. A small, private satisfaction warmed him at the act of revealing the secret. Doom was genuinely taken aback, more so even than when he'd been told by a gene son that Horus was not, in fact, the first Primarch to return. Checked against the dates, Alpharius's story held up. There was no reason to doubt him. The truth was explosive. The Emperor had hidden Alpharius's existence from nearly everyone, and had publicly hailed Horus as the first son returned to focus attention. Alpharius leaned forward, lowering his voice. "You must keep this to yourself," he said. "It must never reach a third person's ears. Tuharn must be wary of him." Doom's face was grave as he swore never to reveal the Imperial secret to anyone. This was no idle promise. What he had been told reached far into the master of mankind's designs, and could have serious repercussions for Horus. Horus Lupercal, Doom's brother, was proud and possessive of his claim to be the first found son. If Horus learned that another brother had been kept quietly on Terra, standing at the master's side before his return, the consequences would be explosive. Doom's thoughts turned over the question again and again: who truly deserved the honor of being the first found son? Two Primarchs had first made themselves known on Terra, Horus, obvious and commanding, and Alpharius, furtive and inscrutable, both plausible claimants. Doom believed the matter was unresolved, not settled. Alpharius had seemed never to have left Terra, and therefore irrelevant to the title, yet in truth he had been briefly lost off-world before the Master personally brought his son back. Horus had come back from the stars bearing a title, the Master of Mankind's first found son. The name carried weight and symbolism, and everyone understood what it meant. Alpharius, however, never hid his contempt. By the tone he used, it was obvious he did not accept Horus's claim. Alpharius believed himself the true first found son. He looked at Horus the way one inspects a clown, someone who, by virtue of a father's favor, had filched glory that ought to have belonged to another. Doom kept his counsel. He had no use for the argument. The honor had been handed down by the Master, not seized by their own hands, and there was no point in denying a decision made by him. He had his reasons, and who would dare oppose the Master of Mankind? Alpharius leaned back and watched Doom's face, reading his thoughts in the smallest twitch of muscle. Doom looked taken aback, but he gave no sign of choosing a side. Alpharius allowed himself a small, private nod of relief. He did not want the glory for himself. He had only planted the notion to see how his brother would react. The question was meaningless on its own. Its answer depended entirely on the will of the Master of Mankind. With a single word from him, 1,000 tongues would rise to justify his actions and turn his decrees into incontestable fact. For the citizens of the Imperium, his word was reality, and if reality did not match his will, he would make it so. Alpharius had watched it happen again and again, men and worlds accused of heresy broken beneath the weight of that truth. Facts could be reshaped, molded, tinted, and twisted by those who controlled the narrative, until they became another sort of truth altogether. He had been formed by that lesson. The Master of Mankind, his father, was a shepherd who guided humanity's flock with the whip of truth. From that image, the Alpha Legion took its creed. Their art was not merely force, but the forging of lies into belief through subtle means, the orchestration of rhetoric, the turning of public opinion, the quiet placement of doubt. By bending what ordinary people accepted as real, they toppled one regime after another. "Brother Alpharius, why were you lurking with Soros?" After a brief exchange, Doom learned where Alpharius had come from and what he was doing now. Whether his brother was telling the truth or not, Doom decided to accept it, for the moment. He had no reliable way to test Alpharius's story, and suspicion would only shut down the conversation. It was better, for the time being, to take him at his word and follow the thread. Alpharius nodded. His smile vanished, and he sat up, suddenly serious. "At first I found Soros intriguing," he said, his voice lowering. "So I infiltrated the Second Legion, but I don't think that anymore. I think he's very dangerous." A cold glint passed through Alpharius's eyes. Soros's behaviors, he implied, were enigmatic and threatening. Doom sat up as well, narrowing his eyes as he regarded his brother. If someone as adept at concealment and investigation as Alpharius called another, our person dangerous, that was not a small thing. It demanded an explanation. Alpharius nodded once, grave. His deep voice laid out what he'd learned. "Soros isn't interested in fighting," he said. "Since his return, the Second Legion's combat activity has steadily dwindled. It's been reduced to ritual, perfunctory campaigns. He spent most of his time wandering Imperial space, meeting with and sometimes cooperating with other legions. He let the names fall easily: Horus Lupercal, Fulgrim, Ferrus Manus. Then he looked up and gestured toward Doom. Next, it's you and Russ. He turned the question to Doom. What do you think is the difference between him and me? Doom's face was suddenly ashen. He answered stiffly, almost hollow. No difference. He's been gathering intelligence on the Primarch legions. In truth, Alpharius and Moribus Saurus had ended up in the same place by different routes. Alpharius moved in secrecy. Everything he did was investigation. Saurus's behavior, by contrast, was baffling. And because Alpharius had been raised at the Master of Mankind's side, his actions carried an air of legitimacy. They looked, to everyone who mattered, like things done with the Master's tacit approval. Moribus Saurus, his origins were wrapped in mist, and everything about him carried a disquieting strangeness. He's no different from me, Alpharius muttered with a tight, half-disgusted laugh. If anything, he's bolder, brazen, as if he wants everyone to see. Except Horus doesn't know that, Alpharius added. Horus actually thinks very highly of him. It's not Horus's fault, Doom said slowly, shaking his head. He spoke without rancor, more as a counterpoint than a rebuke. The Luna Wolves were the first legion to deal with Saurus. Naturally, Horus took him at face value. He simply never suspected anything else. Doom thought for a moment. If Saurus had met someone like Nur first, he suspected, the reaction would have been very different. Nur wouldn't have been so trusting. He frowned and turned back to Alpharius. Why is he so contradictory? He asked. Espionage can be done in secret. Why would he go out of his way to be so obvious about it? Alpharius shook his head. He couldn't say. The more he considered Saurus, the less sense he made, collecting intelligence openly, almost advertising it, as if afraid no one would notice otherwise. What was he hiding? What exactly was he trying to signal? When a Primarch's choices contradict one another, the specifics stop mattering. The contradiction itself becomes the signal. Alpharius's report made Doom think. What exactly was Saurus trying to do? It's not just us, Alpharius said. Even the warriors of the Second Legion don't understand Saurus's intentions. The Legion is unsettled. The Astartes aren't fools. They're quietly guessing at what their gene-father might be planning. Saurus has lost his hold on the Legion, Alpharius continued. He seems to be avoiding the issue deliberately, refusing to take command. I don't know if he's afraid his sons will be implicated, or if he's simply ashamed of something he's done and expects them to despise him for it. As Alpharius spoke, Doom's expression grew darker with confusion. A Primarch neglecting the leadership of his gene sons, or allowing that neglect on purpose, was unheard of. He realized then that what Russ had said only skimmed the surface. Alpharius's infiltration into the Second Legion had revealed far more troubling details. That knowledge brought Doom a complicated mix of private relief and quiet sorrow. Two conflicting emotions stirred in Alpharius. Relief that his precautions had worked, the intelligence leaks from the three legions had been reduced, and a quiet sorrow at the evidence of his brother's ill intent. Strange reports kept piling up. In short, he said, the Second Legion is riddled with oddities. He fixed Doom with a steady look. Brother, I walk in the shadows and have glimpsed a corner of darkness. I haven't yet learned what Saurus intends, he began, his voice sincere. But as someone who deals that in covert work, I must warn you, be wary of Saurus. When Alpharius had mentioned Horus earlier, his tone had been almost teasing. Now there was no jest at all. Doom nodded gravely. I will be careful, he answered, his words as heavy as the room felt. For a while they stood in oppressive silence, two Primarchs conferring in suspicion and unease about the brother they shared. After a brief silence, Alpharius spoke slowly. Your preparations, though, were very good. You preserved the Legion's secrets, Doom replied. You recovered some of the intelligence we'd lost. Doom gave a bitter, rueful smile. I just wish I'd overthought it. I'd rather have been paranoid than missed something. No, Alpharius said, his face growing serious. Preparedness averts peril. It's remarkable you can make the right calls from the smallest clues. He hesitated a moment, then added, doubting a blood brother takes courage. Carrying the responsibility to make a decision takes even greater daring. Doom waved the sentiment away, no longer dwelling on it. Have you asked the Master of Mankind? He asked. Where did Saurus come from? Chapter 223. We are all Alfarius. To learn a brother's true intent, you must probe his past. The matter was delicate. The Emperor himself had brought Moribus Saurus back, and the Emperor's word carried the greatest authority. Yet Saurus's recent behavior was corroding the bonds of brotherhood, something that could not be allowed to stand. I have a plan, Alfarius said. He outlined it without flourish. I will continue my inquiry into Saurus for a while longer. When I have gathered enough, I will compile the findings, slip away, and return to Terra to put questions to Father. You will need solid proof, Doom said. To accuse a blood brother before Father on nothing but suspicion would do more harm than good. That is exactly why I will not act on hunches, Alfarius replied. I need evidence that cannot be ignored. Words without weight are no use when you stand before a Primarch. Doom nodded. The logic was obvious and the prudence necessary. Accusation without substantiation would only weaken their case. Evidence was the only thing that could give their words force against someone of Saurus's stature. It was nearly time to part. Alfarius rose, and Doom accompanied him to the threshold, seeing his concealed brother off. Their meeting had been brief and businesslike. Most of their conversation circled around others, which made the exchange feel formal. They left with little fanfare, each carrying the burden of what must be uncovered. I hope we have time for a proper conversation next time, Doom said, regret shading his voice. He was loath to break the brief meeting. He liked the little confidences Alfarius kept, and there were many of them. When the time is right, Alfarius laughed, the sound rich and easy. I will stand in the light and let every brother know me. By then the great crusade will be drawing to a close, Doom replied, and we'll have plenty of chances to speak. I look forward to that day. They smiled at one another, an understanding passing between them. Their hands closed in a firm clasp. Alfarius was taller, but the height difference meant nothing against the mutual respect in their grip. This is for you. Alfarius released Doom's hand, a glint in his eye, and drew something from inside his armor. Doom looked down to see a circular insignia, a plain, forged steel disc, simple at first glance. Around its rim, a sun was embossed in low relief, and at its center, 3 dragon heads rose in a tight, triumphant knot. The Hydra insignia, Alfarius told him, the emblem of the Hidden Legion. It grants you authority to command Alpha Legion operatives, Alfarius said. Your legion is small and poor at intelligence gathering. My gene sons can make up the difference. They specialize in operating behind enemy lines, unraveling foes from within, harvesting intelligence, and waging information warfare. Doom's eyes went bright. He reached for the gift without a word of refusal, so quickly that Alfarius had no time to change his mind. The offering was priceless. It solved a major weakness. The Destroyer warriors and the Night Watch were the most professional warriors he had, masters of the battlefield. But when it came to clandestine work, they were only competent, not exceptional. The ghosts of the Night Watch excelled at assassination and covert strikes, yet deep infiltration and sustained information warfare remained outside their wheelhouse. Alfarius's operatives would fill that gap. Doom turned the little insignia over in his fingers, then raised it and asked, quiet, "The Alpha Legion?" Alfarius smiled without changing his posture. "The 20th Legion," he said easily. "If it weren't for the Destroyer warrior, I'd be at the very bottom." "We are gene brothers, equals," Doom replied, shaking his head as if to clear it. "There is no higher or lower." He found himself a little off balance. Perhaps he had been in seclusion too long. His brother's mind seemed restless and quick, flickering across thoughts in ways Doom had trouble following. Alfarius said nothing in answer. Instead, he looked at Doom and asked, matter of fact, "You can find them, I assume?" "Yes." Doom did not hide it. He confessed openly that he could locate the Alpha Legion's hidden operatives. Whether Alfarius was testing him or not, Doom felt no reason to lie. After the gift his brother had just given, secrecy would have been petty. Alfarius blinked, a faint surprise crossing his features. He had long underestimated Doom's straightforwardness and generosity. The realization made the corner of his mouth twitch. For all the Alpha Legion's elaborate infiltration and careful obfuscation, Doom had seen through it with a single, unhurried admission. He met his brother's gaze and said solemnly, "The Emperor has given me a shadow mission. Stealth is the duty of me and my gene sons." Doom, understanding the gravity of the task, answered in kind. I promise, unless it's absolutely necessary, I will not interfere with them. He meant it. The existence of a Shadow Legion was vital. Its operatives slipped into other legions to watch for corruption and ill intent. Without Alpharius's own infiltrators, the Empire might never have learned certain things about Legion Primarchs like Saurus. They're hypnotized, Alpharius explained briskly, outlining the Alpha Legion's methods. Once integrated, they become genuine members of whatever legion they join. But they only act when they're activated. You need a passphrase. He paused, then offered the phrase lightly, almost teasing. I am Alpharius. Doom repeated it softly, committing the words to memory. Alpharius stifled a private chuckle. The actual passphrase was nothing more elaborate than his name, and he'd been enjoying the small joke of hearing his brother say it aloud. There was a quiet, almost childish pleasure in hearing his blood say, I am Alpharius. The phrase worked. Anything containing Alpharius would trigger the sleeper agents. Then Doom spoke again. His next words were unexpected, and they stunned Alpharius for a long time. Doom fixed him with a serious look, then, low and playful, repeated the passphrase, We are all Alpharius. For a long, suspended moment, they simply stared at one another, then both broke into laughter. You've grasped the essence of the Alpha Legion, Alpharius said, unusually buoyant. He had never felt such joy. It's time to go, he added, a trace of sadness in his voice, and they shook hands once more, in a final farewell. The universe felt suddenly enormous. Who could say when they would meet again? Alpharius treasured his friendship with Doom. Out of all the faces in the crowd, only his brother had recognized him at a glance. That recognition eased a loneliness he carried deep inside. He waved and began toward the door, a gesture that told Doom he needn't come along, but paused on the threshold. His expression tightened. He turned back toward Doom, mouth opening as if to speak, then closing again. Doom raised a hand, steady and reassuring. Brother, he said, speak freely. Keep away from the 11th Legion. Alpharius hesitated, then spoke again more plainly. My brother, I give you this advice sincerely, for your own good. Doom opened his mouth to ask why, but Alpharius cut him off with a raised hand. At the plaza, where the Emperor announced the Great Crusade, the men who stood there as the 11th were not the 11th at all. They were Alpha Legion impersonators. Doom's pupils tightened as the meaning sank in. Why would the true warriors of the 11th be absent from such a solemn, sacred moment? Alpharius sighed. I don't know much. There are things I either can't or won't reveal. Remember this, he added quietly. If you encounter the 11th Legion's fleet during the Great Crusade, keep your distance, minimize contact. I understand. Doom's face was grave, but his eyes held steady trust. Alpharius nodded, drew the helmet that hung at his hip, and left the room. He did not linger. He retraced his steps swiftly. The elevator reappeared in the garden as he arrived, and he reached out to rouse his gene-son from the self-hypnotic trance. Brother, the infiltrator called, looking up as he greeted his gene-father. His voice carried both excitement and a lingering reluctance. It's time to part again. Alpharius said nothing harsh in reply. The youth had finished his self-gnosis. To Alpharius, he was simply a countryman and a brother. Yes, Alpharius answered, and his tone was honest. He felt the sting of separation as keenly as the other did. They left the flower bed together and walked off toward their respective legions. Doom remained behind in the chamber. He needed to wait, stagger his departure so he and Alpharius did not leave at the same moment. Emerging together would have drawn unwanted attention. He sat back in a chair, legs crossed, arms folded, eyes unfocused as his thoughts drifted. Images and scraps of information about the 11th Legion kept surfacing, and Doom realized with a small jolt how little reliable data existed about that brother Legion. The records were sparse. The 11th numbered only 20,000, operated with extreme secrecy, and kept their distance from other forces of the Great Crusade. Their methods of war were tightly codified. They were disciplined to the point of austerity, their conduct exemplary. Imperial files contained only those terse entries, no dossiers, no campaigns logged, just those few cold lines. Doom had originally assumed the sparse records were simply because the 11th Legion operated far from the main force. Now it occurred to him there was a deeper reason. As the old proverb went, the more important the matter, the fewer the words. He finished his mental review of the data and shut down his analysis. He kept his Alpha brother's warning in mind and forced his curiosity to stay restrained. He would not pry further into the 11th Legion. Rising slowly, he left the private room where they had spoken and made his way toward the garden banquet. What his brother had told him was scant. Doom still needed to speak with Moribus Saurus, who had crossed the stars to come here. 224. Pointer of Doubt. Doom returned to the banquet with his cloak thrown back, and Russ's face was flushed with wine. He looked relaxed and pleased, eyes half closed and a little intoxicated. Saurus, by contrast, sat upright and severe, taking dainty sips as if nothing were out of the ordinary. Around the round table, people were beginning to break off in small groups, drifting toward colleagues from their legions or departments. The movement cleared a space for the three Primarchs. Doom gave a faint, courteous smile, shook the water from his cloak, and settled back into his seat. "All handled?" Russ asked. The words slurred, the question half asleep and half drunk. "Some emergencies with the Space Wolves fleet," Doom replied, polite and concise, giving a brief account of why he'd stepped out earlier. When he'd left, he'd only said that urgent matters required his attention. Now Russ's question gave him an opening to explain. Saurus's silver-gray eyes flickered. He did not take offense at his brother's abrupt departure. Commanders of a fleet could not always be tied to a table. "That's the life of a fleet commander," he said. "If junior officers can't manage, they escalate it." "And it's always urgent," Russ added, a small, rueful smile tugging at his mouth. "The sort that has to be dealt with right away." Relief eased over Doom's usually heroic face, and for a moment he allowed himself to smile. Doom lifted his glass. "To understanding," he said. "Understanding?" Russ snorted. "That deserves 3 penalty drinks, doesn't it?" He ruffled his wolf-like mane and grabbed the wine bottle, topping off Doom's cup without waiting for an answer. Doom drank eagerly and, without a hint of hesitation, held the glass out again. "Another," he demanded. "Bottoms up." He let out a whoop and beckoned to the other two. The wine slid down their throats in quick succession. When Doom flipped his glass upside down to show it was empty, everyone laughed. The interruption thawed whatever chill had lingered in the room. Conversation loosened. Laughter came easier, and the three of them began swapping stories. The universe was vast, and each of them had seen different corners of it. As they talked, they kept surprising one another. Saurus told of a passage through the real universe when he'd come across a peculiar alien people. Their ships were enormous and moved on fixed, unchanging courses. The beings themselves lay in collective hibernation, leaving their vessels to run autonomously. The navigation logs Saurus had seen recorded that those ships had been traveling for 3,000 years. The warriors of the Second Legion boarded the derelict vessel and tampered with its hibernation systems, introducing a poison that quietly killed every alien in stasis. Later, following the great ship's navigation logs, their commander led the Legion to the race's homeworld, only to find that the civilization had already torn itself apart in a civil war and self-destructed. The three of them could only sigh. By chance, the Second Legion had annihilated an entire species, snuffing out the last spark of their culture. Russ was not to be outdone. He told of his own strange encounter. The Space Wolves' fleet had come upon a vast entity adrift in the warp, a tangled mass of abandoned warships, both alien and human, all fused together. The piled hulls created a strong gravity well that kept drawing in more debris and wreckage. Russ led a boarding party into that drifting graveyard and found twisted things crawling through the ribs of ruined ships. In the scavenged skeletons of several vessels, he even saw manufacturing dates stamped 10,000 years in the future. The Space Wolves combed those long-dead ships with care, but they found no secret technology to explain the anomaly. Instead, they found an unfamiliar emblem, a stylized Q. Doom then gave a brief account of the Horanian, the strange black hole species, and sketched out the peculiarities of their culture for his brothers. As the three of them traded stories about these fascinating discoveries, they laughed freely and let their guard down. Emotions showed where duty normally kept them restrained. When the conversation reached its peak, Saurus steered it to the matter that had brought them together. "What about the Randon threat?" he asked. A hard light flickered in Doom's eyes. He knew they had reached the real reason for this meeting. His brothers had come for this very subject. "It is a threat the Imperium of Man cannot ignore," he said, his face tightening and his voice grave. "The power the Randon have demonstrated is extraordinarily dangerous. They must be annihilated." His words were firm, without the faintest hesitation. As the King of Warriors, Doom openly declared the determination to destroy the alien menace. There was no disguise or diplomacy in it. Once the Imperium of Man rose again, there would be nothing but unrelenting hostility between it and the aliens. During the Golden Age, humanity had signed peace treaties with countless alien races, treaties that, time and again, were exploited whenever human worlds were vulnerable. When the Imperium finally returned to reclaim its lost holdings, there was no longer room for trust or tolerance. Too many human worlds had been laid waste. To many in the Imperium, extermination had become the kindest fate an alien could hope for. The Randon were a particular worry. Their numbers and war technology, demonstrated in that last engagement, marked them as a threat on a different scale. After the battle, the Imperium had been forced to rethink everything about the Randon, their capabilities, their intentions, and how best to defend against them. Preparations had to begin at once: fortify the border systems, accelerate fleet construction, and be ready to meet the Randon before their homeworld could be located and weaponized. The next confrontation, everyone agreed, would not be a skirmish, but a direct, full-scale war. Doom lifted his wineglass and took a small, measured sip. "I imagine the Randon feel the same way about us," he said. "They want to enslave humanity." "They retreated this time to prepare for their return," Russ said, his eyes cold and his face set hard. "They want revenge for those dead scum." Soros nodded slowly. His expression was grave. His voice came out low and heavy. "The alien threat is immense. We must unite to face them." "Of course." Doom nodded, echoing his brother's words. The Randon threat was blunt and immediate. Even without unleashing their full power, the pressure they exerted had put the Imperium on edge. Soros was right. The Randon could not be dealt with by a single legion or fleet. To defeat such an unprecedented foe, the Imperium would have to pool all its strength. Soros hesitated, a faint apology in his voice. "What were your losses? Forgive me, it's a presumptuous question." It was, in truth, a delicate question. Casualty figures struck at a legion's honor and let others infer the balance of forces and the exchange of ships, information tightly controlled after major engagements. Only the Emperor and Malkador had the authority to know everything. Ordinary citizens were told only that the Imperium kept winning. Russ waved a hand, unconcerned. "No need to apologize," he said. "Among brothers, we speak plainly." Doom gave Soros a reassuring nod. "Knowing both sides' losses will make you cautious. You could be called into the next operation." The question was probing, and both Doom and Russ stiffened. Doom answered first. "Our fleet, including the First Legion fleet, has lost more than half its strength." He set his wineglass down. The movement, simple as it was, seemed to drain the color from his face. Russ's expression darkened as well. "The Space Wolves lost over 20,000 warriors," he said, his golden eyes reddening with an emotion that was real, even if the precise toll was lower than he let on. The Great Wolf felt the loss keenly. Doom went on, voice low. "The First Legion has also suffered over half its strength. They'll have to pause the Great Crusade, recruit, and recuperate." Nearby, Arius listened in silence. He couldn't help the tiny twitch at one corner of his mouth, a private complaint. Doom Novik and Lehman Russ, one, with thick brows and wide eyes, could lie without once flinching. The other, all rough edges and barbaric charm, was a better actor than Alfarius himself. If he hadn't already received word from his own people, he might have been taken in by the two of them. Their practiced grief, their matching rhetoric. He shook his head and went back to the food on the table. The Nor worlds had many delicacies. If he had the chance, he'd have to ask his brother to send some. Oblivious to that thought, Doom kept talking about the casualties, his heroic expression tinged with sorrow in a way that almost hurt to watch. "Such heavy losses?" Soros frowned, struggling to hide his disbelief. "Are the Randon really that powerful?" Doom and Russ both nodded, their faces tight with fear and worry. When several factions were already in contact, people tended to hold back. There was also the fact that the Randon had been annihilated, no survivors left to tell a different story. Doom leaned in and lowered his voice. Their strength is part of it, he said cautiously. But worse, the Imperium's intelligence was compromised. The Randon got hold of our military data. That leak cost us dearly. If it weren't for the Imperium's warriors, we'd almost certainly have lost the war. Soras shuddered, his silver-gray eyes locked onto Doom, searching for confirmation, as if asking, "Can the Imperium really have a traitor?" Doom only nodded once, silent. "Don't tell anyone," he said quietly. "I'm investigating the spy. I have a few leads." Relief washed over Soras. He exhaled and nodded, trying to digest the explosive news. Doom watched him closely, uneasy. He had suspected Soras of leaking Imperial intelligence and had deliberately let the rumor of an internal traitor slip to see how his blood brother would react. Soras's calm, unremarkable response made Doom worry he had misjudged everything, that he might have been overcautious, or worse, wrong. To be continued. What is your identity? What is your identity? Doom kept asking himself that in the hollow places of his heart. The doubt Alpharius had sown twisted into a long, cracking whip that kept lashing at him, demanding to know why he would even question his own blood. He shouldn't have to. We were brothers, after all. Yet he could not let the question go. Soras's behavior only made the suspicion harder to dismiss. This brother of his moved freely throughout the Imperium of Man, engaging with other Primarchs, studying the fighting doctrines of rival legions. Nothing about those wanderings sat right with Doom. Alpharius's warning no longer sounded like paranoia, it sounded like prudence. Why then did Doom place more faith in Alpharius than in Soras? The answer was simple. Alpharius had been raised beside the Emperor and was an unmistakable Imperial loyalist. When Doom had first found him, Alpharius had not hidden who he was. He admitted his identity openly. That honesty, whatever else it meant, made Doom trust him far more than the evasive Soras. Better to be cautious than to be blind. To avoid a greater mistake, Doom decided to act. He sent out a calculated bait, told his brother, calmly and publicly, that he knew of an internal traitor and was investigating. Doom had set a small trap. If Soras really had a problem, he would grow nervous and hesitate to probe any further. If he was clean, he would apologize once the war with the Randan was over. Doom felt torn. He wanted his caution to prove necessary, but he also hoped it would turn out to be needless. He wanted Soras to be innocent, for his intelligence gathering to be nothing more than an odd hobby, and for his choice to fight alongside his brother's legions to be a purely strategic move to foster closer cooperation in future wars. Soras shook his head, visibly stunned by the news from his brother. "I didn't expect that. Even under the Imperial truth, someone would dare betray the Imperium's interests." Russ's face darkened with hatred, his fangs flashing at the corners of his mouth. "If I find out who did this, I'll skin him alive." The wolves hated traitors. Their punishments were merciless. Russ sounded drunk, his words slurring as he ranted. "They wear human skin but betray their own, repay kindness with treachery." He grew more incoherent and vicious as he spoke. "Skin them first, then immolate them with white phosphorus." The coarse cruelty in his voice made Soras flinch. His face tightened. He put a hand on Russ's arm and said quietly, "That's a little too far, Russ." White phosphorus immolation was no empty threat. It was a feared execution method used by the Imperium to crush stubborn cultists and erase dangerous beliefs through pain. Specialized white phosphorus was smeared all over the condemned. When it was ignited, the 1,000-degree flames ate into flesh and seared toward the bone marrow, producing a level of agony that was almost unimaginable. Even the most resolute devotees found it impossible to hold to their faith in that fire. Many surrendered the moment the flames took hold and begged for a quick death. Cruel? Russ's face was wild and flushed with drink, his eyes half closed as he looked at his brothers. "Let them call us cruel. How many Imperial soldiers have died in the void because leaked intelligence ended up in Xenos' hands? They died without knowing the weapons that killed them were given to aliens by their own kin," he went on. "Our men fight desperately, bleeding for the peace of the Imperium. Human traitors must die." Soras sighed, impassive. "They deserve to die," he said stiffly. Doom nodded in agreement. "I never trusted traitors," he said. "The fall of Nur began with betrayal. Fortresses don't usually crumble from the outside. It's the ones inside who do the real harm." Traders sell out everyone for petty gains and selfish interests. Russ, teeth bared and sounding genuinely drunk, tightened his grip on his cup. If I catch him, I'll kill him myself. Of course, Doom replied without hesitation. Soras looked at his raging bro, there and slowly inclined his head in assent. There's another possibility. Doom lifted his wineglass and indicated for Russ to refill it, then let the thought out slowly. What if the human trader isn't betraying the Imperium of their own free will? Tell us. Soras' eyes brightened. He made a small motion for his brother to go on. Doom set the glass down and spoke deliberately. The Randon's brain fluid is dangerous. Even a tiny dose can put an ordinary person under Randon control. He watched his listeners closely as he continued. So maybe, somewhere we haven't discovered yet, the Randon have already taken over certain high-ranking Imperium officials and used them to gather intelligence. That's a very real possibility, he added. Who would willingly accept the eternal disgrace of colluding with Xenos? No one takes that choice lightly. Officials with access to Legion intelligence aren't low-level bureaucrats. They're people with power and influence inside the Imperium, people who can make decisions. The Randon can't buy them off. It would have to enslave their minds. As he spoke, Doom kept glancing at Soras, trying to read his reaction. But Soras's face remained like a still pool, empty, unreadable, as if the subject didn't concern him at all. Doom felt a strange mixture of relief and unease at that blankness, uncertain what to make of it. Soras felt two things at once when his brother showed no reaction. For a moment he was relieved. Maybe Doom really wasn't involved, and everything so far had been only his own suspicion. But that relief was shadowed by an equal fear. Perhaps Doom did know, had simply buried his feelings, and was sliding further down a darker path. A hard-won victory, Soras said, shaking his head with regret and a hint of admiration as he looked at Doom. Your fleet must have been the decisive factor. Doom felt his stomach drop. His worst fear was unfolding. The Randon understood the Imperium well, but they knew nothing of the Nor worlds, and the Imperium's xeno-intelligence apparatus was now feverishly hungry for information about those worlds. If anyone had been asking Doom directly for Nor data, he would have had them arrested already. That left only one possibility. The only people probing the Nor worlds were Randon's slaves. Russ, standing nearby, felt his hand twitch. He, too, grasped the implication. Alfarius watched from a distance, eyes narrowing as he tried to read Soras's motives. As a master strategist, he could not fail to grasp how vital intelligence secrecy was at this juncture. Everyone involved in the Randon War was on edge, unwilling to allow even the smallest lapse. Yet when Moribas Soras spoke up, his question did more than stir conversation. It raised the danger level for himself and cast fresh suspicion on Doom and the others. What made it worse was the manner of the inquiry. Blunt, unadorned, a simple question with no pretense or hedging. That very straightforwardness made his motives maddeningly hard to read. What exactly was he trying to do? The three Primarchs found themselves asking the same question at once. Horus had named him War Master. Soras's strategic acumen was unquestionable, and it was unthinkable that he could have failed to foresee his brother's doubts. If outsiders had claimed Soras carried the bearing of a War Master, there might have been room for argument, but Horus's endorsement settled that matter. Still, Soras remained a bundle of contradictions. His actions and mannerisms constantly pulled in opposing directions. In a single instant, 1,000 calculations spun through their minds, and they all landed on the same verdict. This man was a problem. Doom, Russ, and Alfarius all believed, deep down, that Soras was acting recklessly. They didn't know his motives, and none of them could afford to reveal anything about the Nor worlds. You can't say that, Doom said, shaking his head, a sadness around his eyes. Yes, the Nor fleet is stronger than the Xenos', but firepower alone isn't everything. Without Imperial troops to engage them, you can fully exploit that advantage. We can admit their firepower is formidable. How formidable, though, is something you'll have to deduce, Soras, Doom continued. If you really do have contacts among the Randon, the warships that manage to escape will tell you exactly how Nor vessels perform. Everyone in the Imperium agrees Nor tech outstrips ours, but no one can say by how much. If Imperial ships had your kind of firepower, he added, wouldn't dealing with the Randon be a lot easier? Soros met Doom's gaze. His silver-gray eyes shone, as if picturing the Randan fleet in retreat. Doom's finger faltered mid-gesture. He hadn't expected his brother's probing to be so clumsy. That decided, he stopped holding back. He would answer Soros directly and on Soros's terms. If his brother was going to flout the rules, Doom wouldn't resort to tricks either. If Moribus Soros intended to use moral pressure to extract Norworld's technology from him, then they would make their positions explicit and settle it point by point. "I am the Lord of the Norworlds," Doom said, his expression hardening. A cold, intimidating presence radiated from him as he fixed Soros with an unyielding, dark stare and asked, low and measured, "Moribus Soros, in what capacity are you speaking to me?" Even restrained, that deep, authoritative voice pressed down on the room. It fell silent at once. The custodians and the Space Marines lowered their eyes and sat perfectly still, afraid to make the slightest move. The 2nd Legion Primarch's guards stood like statues, unsure what to do. Any action now would only escalate the tension. Their best option was to sit quietly in their seats and await the Primarch's command. If you have more of the chapter, paste it and I'll revise the rest in the same style. Chapter 226, Short Break. I've got too much on my plate, so I'm taking today off. I haven't rested since yesterday afternoon, and I'm completely worn out, dark circles and all. I'll get some rest and come back with more updates for my brothers soon. Thanks for your patience. Chapter 227, Suspicion and Separation. Doom's blunt question landed on Soros like a hammer blow. There was no pretense, no careful probing, just a cold, surgical demand for clarity. His words cut through the usual veils of rhetoric and left the assembled Primarchs momentarily stunned. "What are you, then?" Doom had asked. The question seemed absurd in its simplicity. Soros was a dozen things at once. Lord of the Norworlds, warrior king of the Night Watch, a destroyer warrior, an independent power acknowledged by the Emperor. He was also Doom's blood brother, an ally of the Imperium of Man, and a ruthless overlord who ruled the stars. Which of those faces should answer this question? Which title would govern the conversation? Soros felt the weight of the choice. He understood exactly why Doom had put him on the spot. He was being forced to declare the capacity in which they would speak. If he answered brother, the exchange would be personal, informal, and its tone would hinge on their relationship. If he answered representative of the Imperium, a routine inquiry would be instantly elevated into a matter of state, with all the attendant protocol and danger. Whoever would sit at that table would have to be the Emperor himself, or someone he had specifically authorized. Could Soros, then, represent the Imperium? The answer was plain. No, not Soros, not any of the Primarchs, not even Malkador the Regent. The Imperium spread across countless stars, but aside from the Master of Mankind, no single individual could speak for it. His tentative probe met an iron fist. Soros had not expected his brother's reply to be so blunt, so entirely free of the usual courtly give and take. "Just idle speculation," he said, and shook his head, cutting the idea off. His blood brother's firmness had taken him aback and closed the matter. The rank the Emperor had granted Doom lay between them like an uncrossable chasm, rendering words powerless. Before the meeting, Soros had read the Star Pact and had turned every clause over in his mind. He finally decided there was nothing more to be done. So long as the Norworlds acknowledged themselves as part of humanity, the Imperium of Man had no right to interfere within their borders. The Imperium's two most sensitive concerns were artificial intelligence and Xenos. AI had been dealt with by a separate pact and was being managed. Xenos were enemies both sides were eager to exterminate, so there was no conflict there either. Perhaps the Master of Mankind had foreseen the scrutiny and threats that Doom and the Norworlds would face, and therefore granted them extraordinary freedom and autonomy, isolating them from outside entanglements. Soros sighed inwardly, mourning his own impotence, and gave up on any further probing. He knew as well that there was a gulf between him and his brothers. He did not want to explain why, and he did not blame their caution, only he carried the bitter truth inside. Who was he, if not a man full of sorrow? He shook his head and let out a bitter smile. "The technology of Nur," he said at last, "contains many techniques expressly forbidden by the Imperium of Man. My sorrow lies in these restrictions. If we could use them freely, we would gain an unparalleled advantage in the war against Xenos. When his brother spoke so plainly, Doom understood that he had dropped whatever objections he'd been nursing. Doom let his oppressive aura fall away, nodded and sighed. Indeed. The brief confrontation between the Primarchs dissolved as if it had never happened. The tension in the inner circle eased. The custodes and space marines around them exhaled in relief that things had not escalated further. Russ, shaking off his drunken manner, added, "But the price we paid in the past makes us dare not venture there again." Their words were deliberately circumspect. Never once did any of them say artificial intelligence, and yet the meaning was clear to all. "I truly wish I could see the brilliance of the Norworlds," Soros said, taking a slow sip of wine. His eyes shone with genuine longing, free of guile or calculation. Doom smiled and picked up the invitation without hesitation. "You may come with us. Russ and I should go back and get our ships repaired." Doom felt no probing, no deception, only genuine longing and unguarded anticipation in the voice. Russ added, with that blunt animal certainty of his, "It would be perfect for the three of us to go together and drink in Doom's homeland." His brother's desire was plain and unvarnished. He truly wanted to see it, to enjoy it undisturbed. Soros shook his head, smiling bitterly. "No, I don't have the time. I must hasten the Great Crusade." He went on, blunt and relentless. The Emperor himself had urged him to speed up the conquests. The Second Legion's recent troubles left no room for delay. Their ships needed repair, and the Legion had to be reorganized. Each reason was stated plainly, his eyes flashing silver as he insisted the campaign could not be postponed. Doom lifted his cup to accept the toast, but something small and telling caught his attention. Soros never called the Emperor father. That single omission spoke louder than the rest. It revealed a tangle of complications beneath the surface. Russ and the other brothers all called the Emperor father and wore it as a badge of honor. Doom was different. Apart from King Nawick, he refused to call any man father. That made him wonder what Soros's reasons might be. "Brother," Doom asked solemnly, searching Soros's face, "what is troubling you that you won't share it with your blood brothers?" He was probing for the root of the strange behavior he'd noticed. Soros only shook his head, drained the wine in his hand, and declined to answer. He opened his mouth. "Brothers, but the words died on his lips. For a moment he looked torn, then his hesitation hardened into resolve. Doom and Russ exchanged puzzled glances. They could not guess what inner conflict had driven their brother. At last, Soros set his jaw and said firmly, "Everything I do is supported by ample personal reasons. I must do this." The statement was final. There would be no more questions. Doom's dark eyes were full of pity as he looked at his brother. He shook his head, helpless and pained. He could hear the hurt in Soros's voice, and beneath it he felt the unyielding resolve. "It's time to go," Soros said. He rose slowly. The scrape of his power armor sounded faint in the hall. A small, indifferent smile touched his lips. His purpose for coming had been seen through. The two brothers and the 3 fleets with them had been on guard and had detected his probing. For everyone's sake, he chose to leave quietly. He offered no speeches. In its own restrained way, it was a proper parting. His abrupt appearance at the banquet had put them all on edge. He had not been a welcome guest, and the awkwardness of that sank into him like a sourness pooling in his chest. He couldn't quite name the feeling, disappointed that he'd gleaned nothing, yet oddly relieved by that very lack. The emotion was contradictory and complicated. "We'll see you out." Doom and Russ rose as well, as warm as they'd been when he arrived. They understood Soros was determined and didn't try to change his mind. They only stood to accompany their brother. Soros nodded without a word. With Doom at the lead and Russ at his side, the 3 of them left the banquet together. The Primarch's guard rose as one, and after bidding quick farewells to their Legion cousins, fell in behind their Genefather. They reached the landing pad and watched Soros's shuttle lift off. The stars streaked across Russ's eyes as he followed the craft until it was a speck. He exhaled softly. "He carries a terrible burden," he said. "Perhaps one day he can put it down and talk to us properly. Then there will be no more calculations, no more caution," Doom replied, voice quiet. "We could just speak as brothers." Doom's face remained unreadable, but behind it lay a deeper worry about Sora's true purpose. We do not know his full aim, he admitted, but we sincerely hope he will let us in. Not long after Soros departed the Royal Majesty, an uncanny light washed across the Morse star system. The Second Legion's fleet slipped into the warp, leaving the Randan battlefield behind and setting course once more along the Great Crusade. They needed to take the field at once, to press the war and seize territory faster, if they hoped to make up for lost ground and avoid drawing the Emperor's ire. That urgency hung over everything, even the celebration. After the Lord of the Second Legion departed, the banquet only grew livelier. Legionnaires relaxed and spoke openly, retelling their deeds from the Randan War and comparing scars and trophies with their Gene brothers. There was laughter and boasting, but also quiet grief. More than a few Space Marines slipped away for a moment of private mourning, remembering battle brothers who had paid the ultimate price fighting Xenos. The revel lasted a full 240 Terra hours, 10 days, arranged so troops came and went in shifts until every soldier had taken part. Each time a group rose to leave, Doom and Russ would call down a few words of blessing from the high platform, sending them off with solemn goodwill until the hall emptied and filled again. The Lord Generals on the War Council, those damned, bureaucratic old men, they are meticulous to a fault. Russ's holographic figure spat in contempt as he tore into the council and their mortal staff. They sit there counting casualties, doing cold arithmetic to decide the absolute limit of when we can be sent back into the fight. Next time I go to Terra, he went on, voice hard, I'm going to drag them onto a ship and make those old officials watch the true brutality of the battlefield. A warrior's life isn't a number, it's a bloody, visible end. He ground his teeth and kept cursing the council. The outburst was only partly anger. Since his last lessons with Horus and that long conversation with Doom, Russ had changed. The Great Wolf felt the cruelty of war more keenly now. He understood that victory could only be bought with living, breathing men. His bitter words were a vent for that understanding, the frustration of a warrior forced to be measured by spreadsheets. Doom said nothing. He listened, the corner of his mouth twitching into the hint of a smile. The fleet remained in the Morse system for a month. When they finally departed, the initial repairs were done and the ships were ready to move out. Dedicated courier ships carried the war documents back to Terra for the War Council's review. Once the orders were confirmed, the reply from Terra arrived. The War Council backed the Warrior King. The First Legion was to rendezvous at the Forge World Shana to restore military discipline and carry out ship repairs. They were not to depart for a year. The Space Wolves fleet, praised for their timely aid and valiant fighting, received numerous commendations and honors. In recognition, they were granted a year to choose any Forge World they wished for repairs and to replenish their ranks. Doom gave no answer to Russ's outburst. Instead, he looked to the holographic display and said simply, "Prepare to depart. We will go to Nur together." Russ's scowl dissolved as if it had never existed. His eyes brightened, and the bitter resentment was instantly swept away by a childlike eagerness. He rubbed his hands together and exclaimed, "The pack is ready. We can leave at once." In the days of waiting that followed, Russ grew increasingly restless. Once the immediate affairs of the Legion were settled, he searched for anything to occupy himself with, unable to sit idle. Doom spent those years drilling the Night Watch and instructing his own descendants in the martial arts. He ran war simulations alongside human officers and absorbed as many combat techniques as he could. One memorable incident broke the routine. Bored and restless, Russ challenged Doom to a wrestling match, Doom's specialty. Russ won the first bout, but after that he kept losing. Unwilling to grant defeat to Doom, the Wolf King insisted they pit their genetically enhanced heirs against one another. That, too, ended in an even more decisive loss for Russ. 2 consecutive defeats left Russ humiliated, and he swore to recover his honor. After talking it over with Doom, they set up a formal competition between the Space Wolves and the Night Watch, complete with a traditional Fenrisian betting pool. The teams fought a best-of-9 series. When the dust settled, Russ lost and was forced to forfeit the teeth of a Fenrisian sea monster. Furious, the Great Wolf threw his wolfkin into relentless training, sharpening their bodies and minds and nursing a slow-burning plan for revenge. Restless and constrained by the loss, Russ then led the elite of his pack on a purge through a nearby star sector. Countless Xenos civilizations were hunted and annihilated. Some of those worlds were barely past agricultural feudalism or still in their technological awakening, but the space wolves spared none. The merciless pack had cleansed every Xenos presence they found, and in doing so, they'd effectively handed the habitable worlds over to the Imperial Department of the Interior. Russ had long wanted to leave the Moore star system and travel to Nur to see his brother. Now that permission had finally come through, excitement tightened his voice. He wanted to depart at once. "I'll inform the fleet to prepare for departure," he said hurriedly, then cut the transmission to begin the long journey's preparations. Doom only shook his head. Russ had the patience of a hunting wolf, relentless in war, able to stalk and wear down his prey. But in other matters he tended toward impatience and a lack of careful planning. Perhaps it was a pose he cultivated. That same apparent haste had never once steered him wrong. The hollow faded, and Doom looked down to find Urien Bendegree kneeling respectfully at his feet. Doom composed himself, his expression hardened into something close to severity. In a quietly measured voice he asked Urien, "Grand Master, have your post-war arrangements been made?" Urien bowed his head and answered in a low, respectful tone, "Great Primarch, I have relinquished the title of Grand Master. I am now a Watcher." Watcher Urien Bendegree. Doom nodded once, acknowledging the change. Urien had indeed given up the office and taken station in the Moore star system as a Watcher, keeping constant vigil against any return of the Rangdan. For a long moment, the two of them simply regarded one another, the silence heavy in the throne room. Then Doom's question came again, drifting down from the throne in that same calm voice. "Who now holds the post of Grand Master of the First Legion?" The question made the Watcher's body go rigid. Urien's heart tightened. He could not read the Primarch's intent and dared not guess. He answered with a trembling voice, "It is the Lord of the Void Sky Army." Because of his outstanding military record, he received a great many nominations. The name conjured up the image of that bold, relentless warrior in Doom's mind, and he murmured softly, "So it's him." Urien tensed even more, uncertain how to take the Primarch's tone, whether that murmur carried approval or the first ripple of displeasure. Did he mean to meddle in the First Legion's affairs, or did he have other designs? Urien stared at Doom, worry written on his face. Doom read him like an open book. "Don't be nervous," he said. "How the First Legion chooses its Grand Master is not something I intend to involve myself in. That is for you to decide." Interlegion matters were always delicate, and even a Primarch had to be careful about stirring trouble. Interfering in another legion's internal affairs could have consequences. A single misstep might spark a long chain of problems. The punishment for the First Legion had already been set. Doom had settled that, yet who would serve as Grand Master was not for him to name. When Urien heard that, the tension in his shoulders eased. He had been afraid the Primarch would impose a leader, and once Doom spoke, refusal would have been impossible. "You may go," Doom added, waving the matter away. With this final task complete, it was time to leave Morse and make for Nur to re-equip the forces. Doom's eyes lingered on the horizon with a touch of nostalgia. He had been away from Nur for years, and it was time to return. The fleet's return wasn't just to repair battle-damaged ships. It was to refit and rearm for the next Rangdan strike. Urien understood that when the Rangdan came back, or if the Imperium discovered Rangdan-held space, the fighting would ratchet up to an entirely different intensity. There was no time to be complacent. Preparations had to be thorough. "Farewell, Warrior King. Farewell, Great Wolf." Urien bowed and stepped back. He would leave the Great Crusade and remain on the old battlefield to supervise the fortification of the Morse star system. Warp light flared across the void as the Nur First Fleet engaged its drives and slipped into the warp. The Space Wolves followed. The two massive armadas vanished from real space together. The eastern end star territory was enormous, the largest sector the Imperium had planned. A convoy traveling from its rim to the Nor worlds would need at least 3 months. Under ideal conditions and with the First Fleet's superior navigation, the journey could be cut to half that time. But Doom, mindful of the Space Wolves, deliberately slowed the fleet, which naturally lengthened the transit. The Space Wolves and the First Fleet could not afford to separate. They had to watch each other's backs. Both forces were sailing on battle-scarred hulls that could not survive another high-intensity engagement. If they ran into hostile Xenos while in the warp, the fleet that looked enormous on paper would be cripplingly weakened in practice. For Russ, the voyage grew increasingly tedious. On the material plane, he could find things to occupy himself, but while the fleet drifted through the warp, there was nothing to do but wait and let time crawl by. At last, after a long passage, the wounded armada lumbered back into real space and into the Nurse system. The ships arrived at Mandeville Point, the Stargate world that serves as the gateway to the Nor worlds, emerging in large numbers from the warp like wounded metal behemoths. Vessels queued at the gate to enter or exit jerked to attention at the sight of the incoming armada. No one assumed it was hostile. Nur's authorities had issued no alarms, which suggested the newcomers were not enemies. Still, every faction in the system trained long-range sensors and shipborne optics on the arrivals, trying to determine who had come through the gate. The gateway system had long since turned into a mosaic of human outposts, each faction carving itself a foothold among the gates. So when their telescopes relayed back the images, everyone who saw them breathed as one. Imperial warships, their armored hulls crisscrossed with scars, torn and jagged. There were melt lines from lost fire, ragged holes burned by plasma, and gouges from weapons no one could immediately identify. The fleet was vast, dozens, perhaps hundreds of ships of every class, and virtually every hull bore grievous wounds. Observers could only speculate what nightmarish engagement could have left it so thoroughly bled. Then a single, gigantic warship slid out of the Stargate. A carved wolf's head loomed along her flank. The Space Wolves' flagship, the Raffenkel, had arrived. Those with sharp eyes recognized the colossal vessel at once, a living emblem of imperial pride, the flagship of a Primarch. 29. Prosperous scene. The Gloriana-class battleship was in a pitiful state. Sections of her broadside armor had been blown away, layered decks lay exposed and mangled, and the hull was streaked with damage from stem to stern. Airtight bulkheads in the worst hit zones were sealed tight to prevent decompression and the chain of secondary catastrophes that would follow. Sparks and flares spat into the void as some of the most badly damaged vessels detonated the moment they dropped out of the warp. Rescue ships waiting by the Stargate swarmed the stricken hulls, coating burn patches with fire-suppressant gel and containing the worst of the blazes to limit further losses. One by one, more warships emerged through the gate, battered, smoking, and incomplete. Both the Royal Majesty and the Nur contingents bore heavy scars. Whole squadrons were conspicuously absent. The sight drew a collective gasp from the crowd. 2 Primarchs had returned at once, and both of their fleets had clearly been savaged. The exact course of the fighting was impossible to piece together at a glance, but the broad picture was unmistakable. From the pattern of damage, the 2 fleets had been fighting on the same field against a single enemy. Whispers and quick calculations rippled through the onlookers as speculation and worry spread. What kind of war could force 2 Primarchs to fight side by side, and at such great cost? Opportunity and risk are never far apart. A conflict on that scale would swallow whole regions, even an entire star sector, opening up vast new territories to be claimed. Rogue traders lived for chances like that. They chased profit first, and they rarely abandoned a newly discovered world. Did terrifying Xenos stand in the way? When the potential rewards outweighed the danger, Xenos ceased to be a deterrent. Within the rogue trader houses, sharp-minded patriarchs were already scheming to seize whatever advantages they could. Others hesitated, convinced it was not yet the time to move. The Imperium released almost no details about the campaign, a sure sign the foe was formidable. Silencing the news was meant to keep the populace calm, not to disguise success. So some smelled opportunity, others smelled disaster. Human nature being what it was, the same facts produced wildly different conclusions. Whatever they thought, when the fleet poured out of the Stargate and filled the void, the sight knocked the wind out of everyone who watched. The Armada was magnificent and terrible. Many rogue traders watched it with something very close to fear. Information is the lifeblood of a merchant house. the most reliable way to make profit, and the family's most precious asset. Rogue traders traded in secrets, and their intelligence on both allies and enemies was notoriously precise. So when merchants compared the reports coming in from the Imperium with those from Nur, they were stunned. Nearly half the composition of the Primarch fleet was unaccounted for. On the comms channels, the rogue traders murmured a string of stunned, half-joking warnings. Restraint, control, impulse, madness, as if trying on different explanations for what they were seeing. The mere presence of the fleet had already sparked an uproar across trade lanes. Whatever the traders thought, Nur did not care. The first fleet arrived at the gateway system. The flagship Royal Majesty keyed into the quantum network and poured every datum into the shared stream. Manifests, movement orders, sensor logs. From the gateway world starport, a host of tugcraft launched, coming alongside and guiding the Space Wolves ships in, helping them spool down and berth safely. The system, already busy, grew even more crowded as arrivals and departures multiplied. After the brief port operations, the first fleet slipped back into transit, leaving the gateway system behind and heading deeper into the core regions of the Nur worlds. Only Hrafnkel's Space Wolf ships accompanied them as they made their way to the Nur core world. The prosperity here surpasses even the solar system, Russ say, D, standing at the Royal Majesty's bridge viewport and watching the busy star system. A rare note of admiration softened his normally bestial eyes. His words came honestly, moved by the sight before him. Around the colossal stargate, traffic flowed like a governed river. On its upper level, fleets of every size were lined up in neat lanes, obeying traffic protocols, loaded with cargo and streaming out of the system. Cargo haulers towed massive freight barges behind them, bringing supplies to exchange with the Nur worlds. Both the upper and lower levels maintained orderly entry and exit, hundreds of ships arriving or departing every minute. Not far from the gate rose two mushroom-shaped starports, each hundreds of kilometers across and at least 3,000 kilometers tall. Though they shared a common style, their functions were different. One was a bustling hub of material trade, crowded with merchant vessels loading and unloading goods. The other side of the starport was quieter, but it bristled with weapons. Rows of warships of every design lay at anchor. The battered remnants of the Space Wolves fleet were being shepherded in by tugboats from the military docks, each hull guided slowly into repair berths. In the system's central lanes, gigantic space stations loomed, their surface decks stamped with a dozen different crests, rogue trader void settlements clustered like merchant citadels. The sight was reflected in Russ's eyes. He let out a long, involuntary sigh. His chest swelled with an odd pride at the prosperity of the Nur worlds. It was busy, but nothing was chaotic. Administrators, using enlightened methods, had turned what had been an ordinary star system into a vital center of commerce. "This place is nothing like when I left," Doom said, clicking his tongue at the gateway world's explosive growth. When he'd first planned the gateway system, its purpose had been straightforward: serve as an exchange with the Imperium. He had never imagined that a steady influx of merchants would turn a desolate system into something like this. He raised a hand and tapped the viewport lightly, watching the traffic beyond with a look equal parts approval and disbelief. Data streamed across the floor-to-ceiling viewport, and the information blinking there left both Primarchs staring in stunned silence. The gateway system had 6 planets in total: Nur's exclusive gateway world, the one world already allotted to the Imperium, and 4 others whose land, according to the feed, had been driven to astronomical prices. Nur had always been cautious about opening up planetary real estate, and that caution had created a situation in which every square of ground was worth a fortune. In the gateway system, the phrase, "every inch of land is worth its weight in gold," wasn't a figure of speech, so much as a literal market truth. "This says an undeveloped world is worth more than 10 full-strength war fleets?" Russ rasped, voice tight. His face contorted, bloodshot eyes fixed on the numbers. His breath came faster. He watched the 4 worlds coiling in orbit around the inner star as if they were bait hung in space, and the math made them even more maddening. If each of the 4 was valued at over 10 fleets, that added up to more than 40 fleets worth of wealth waiting out there. He thought in fleets because the Imperium, thought in fleets: war fleets, transport fleets, and civilian convoys. Even within war fleets, there was a distinction: conquest fleets and patrol fleets, and the sums the feed was throwing around were enough to buy a staggering amount of military power. Transport fleets carry war material and tithed resources. Civilian convoys are often sprawling affairs made up of countless transports escorted by a handful of warships. A true battle fleet, by contrast, is a different beast. It needs at least 10 capital ships, no fewer than 100 combat vessels, and a host of auxiliary squadrons to support them. Greed flared across Russ's face like a torch. He stared as if staring at treasure, unable to fathom how 4 undeveloped D-worlds could be worth more than everything the Space Wolves possessed. Their fleet had not been handed to them. The Space Wolves had bled for every ship they fielded. "My lord, it's not like that," Sophia said, appearing at their side and bowing slightly. "If Nur were willing to sell, the actual price would be double." Russ went pale. His nostrils flared, his breath quickened. He imagined 80, 100 fleets hanging silent in the void. For the first time, he looked directly at Doom standing beside him, and the scale of his brother's wealth sank in. If Fenris alone were worth 100 fleets, he thought, he'd be tempted to wrap the whole world up and sell it. Doom felt the fiery stare on him. He didn't dare meet it. He just scratched his cheek awkwardly, a little embarrassed. The whole situation had turned out far different from what he'd expected. Humanity's potential was astonishing in every direction, and he had badly underestimated the wealth commerce could create. In the Gateway system, every world fell under Nur's authority. The Gateway world itself was Nur's administrative heart, processing tens of millions of settlement requests every day. The planet assigned to the Imperium was slightly smaller than Terra, and under very different management, it had been transformed into an immense hive city. Since diplomatic ties had been established with the Imperium, entire continents had been turned into sprawl, their tallest spires piercing the atmosphere. More than 50 billion people had migrated from the Imperial homeworld to this place. Strangest of all, despite that enormous population, there was remarkably little poverty. A great number of the migrants were descendants of imperial dignitaries, and even nobles from inside the Imperium, who settled there and brought capital and influence that ensured the world prospered. To cater to the tastes of imperial dignitaries, the planet had opened vast entertainment districts, and noble tourists from across the Imperium poured in. The more Doom read, the more astonished he became. A world of 50 billion people had lifted itself out of poverty purely through tourism. The planetary governor had to be a genius at governance. Even stranger, the world paid double tithes, one portion to Terra, another to Nur. Doom skimmed past the routine entries with a shake of his head, then paused as his brow tightened. In the Gateway system, the Adeptus Mechanicus from Mars had purchased a discrete pocket of space at an outrageous price and built their own station there. Officially, they accepted Nur's laws and refrained from prying into Nur's technological secrets, but their presence still set Doom on edge. The Mechanicus had opened shops aboard the station, hawking goods shipped from Mars. He narrowed his eyes and turned to Sophia. "What's going on here?" Chapter 230, She is So Beautiful. Russ heard his brother's question, glanced up, and caught sight of the incoming message. He made a throat noise of amusement, tried to hold it back, and then let out a laugh. The red-robed oddities from the Adeptus Mechanicus, beaten in the Stellar Accord, had come here supposedly for revenge. But it wasn't revenge so much as a pointed attempt to annoy Doom. Sophia swept her hand across the viewport, and the data display changed. "They're operating under newer law," she said. "They're registered as a vendor inside a space station. Their actions are legal and compliant. Under the gate law you enacted, I have no authority to eject them," she added. Doom skimmed the profile files, and a sneer crossed his face. "How interesting." The Mechanicus station stocked a broad range of weapons and industrial hardware at rock-bottom prices. According to Sophia's calculations, their prices barely covered cost, an obvious selling at a loss to build reputation tactic intended to stir trouble throughout the gate system. Doom sneered and shook his head. The red-robed figures of the Adeptus Mechanicus were not chanting binary as expected. They were poring over the newer law, checking every action against its statutes to avoid being expelled. "Have the Adeptus Mechanicus representative come see me," Doom said lightly, but the command was absolute. A Primarch's order could not be refused. Even if Mars had not technically broken the law, it had crossed Doom's patience and would be answered for. After a pause, he added, "And summon a rogue traitor of unimpeachable reputation, someone of integrity and good conduct." "Understood." Sophia gave a quick curtsy and turned away, her silhouette receding as she went to make the arrangements. "It's truly prosperous here," she murmured. "No, I mean a different kind of prosperity." Russ cut in, eyes on the bustling lanes beyond the viewport. You can feel it in the passing ships, that rising excitement, the hope for life. Lemon Russ, Lord of the Space Wolves, laid a huge hand against the glass and exhaled, a deep, world-weary sigh. Russ had never seen hope and confidence like this anywhere else. The gate system of the Nor worlds, and this was only the outskirts, not the true core, thrummed with a vitality he had rarely witnessed. Machines and humans moved together as if grown from the same root. Doom answered his brother solemnly. "Because we are united, human and machine truly are one." "We never treated them like servants," Doom added. "We give them equal respect. Machines with souls will not betray us." Russ only shook his head. He understood the sentiment. He could see and even admire the care they showed, but he could not ignore the Emperor. Much of humanity's current condition had been set in motion by the chain reaction after the machine rebellion. He did not know the full truth of that uprising, whether the machines had revolted against unbearable oppression or whether it had been a treacherous, one-sided betrayal, was no longer something anyone could determine with certainty. What he did know, as a loyal member of the Imperium, was that he must follow the Emperor's decrees. The ban on artificial intelligence was an iron law engraved by the Emperor himself. As a Primarch, one of the Emperor's 21 sons, Russ was duty-bound to uphold it. If a Primarch ever took the lead in open opposition, what would be left of the Emperor's authority? The thought lingered in Russ's mind until Doom, reading him as easily as a map, exhaled and laid a hand on his shoulder. "Understand the Emperor. Respect the Emperor," Doom said quietly. "Meet him with that in your heart." To him, the Emperor was more than a ruler. He was living human history. His decisions could look brutal at a glance, even crude, but there was weight and purpose beneath them. Russ's anger sagged under that reasoning. Doom softened the moment with a small smile. "Sit tight," he added. "We're about to enter the warp again." The first fleet made good speed. Soon they were sliding toward another stargate, bound for the true Nor worlds. Russ moved to the observation deck and, as he often did, sat with his brother to drink tea and watch the stars smear into streaks of light. A pang of homesickness hit him, and he slapped a palm to his forehead. "I need to bring Frecky and Gary," he said, half to himself. He hadn't seen his great wolves in too long. He tapped open a holographic comm and sent a terse request to his Primarch's guard. "Send Frecky and Gary to Doom's homeworld." Doom raised an eyebrow at the order. He missed the disciplined, hulking wolves too. Russ waved a dismissive hand at his wolf brothers, as if put out by their fuss, but the smile in his eyes betrayed him. "They're clamoring to see you," he said. Soon, the two giant wolves boarded a shuttle from the Hrafnkel, bound for the Royal Majesty. As the ship slipped into the warp and the bridge gates cycled open, the wolves burst onto the bridge and charged straight for the Primarch. "Woof!" One of them leapt into Doom's arms. Doom caught him easily, grinning as he buried his hand in the massive head and began to stroke. Frecky's jaws hung open, tongue lolling. He was panting and drooling all over Doom's chest. Jerry, seeing the best spot already taken, circled the seat and began anxiously nudging Doom's leg. "Good boy," Doom murmured, patting Frecky with one hand and scratching beneath his chin with the other. Frecky closed his eyes, tail thumping in contentment. Jerry let out a plaintive, wronged whine to make his case. "All right, don't make a fuss." Doom reached down and scratched Gary too, feeling the rough, bristly texture of the wolf's pelt under his fingers as the smaller wolf settled, satisfied at his feet. Russ covered his eyes, unwilling to watch his wolf brothers at play, their tails wagging, their pleading looks for attention so uncannily like an old Terra dog. He sometimes couldn't understand why they were so fond of Doom. The trip was short, Between the antics of the two men and the two wolves, the royal majesty, escorted by the Hrafnkel, headed back to the land of light, Nur. When Russ finally peeled his hands away, his animal eyes widened. A low, reverent growl escaped him as the view outside the window changed. Approaching Nur felt like entering another universe. As the administrative center of the Nor worlds, Nur was alive with traffic. Countless ships in constant motion, their engines glittering like a sky full of stars. Nur's ships bore none of the ponderous, utilitarian look of the Imperium. Descended from designs of the Dark Age of technology, they had a distinct, almost fragile elegance. White vessels shimmered as if woven from light, appearing and vanishing without a trace, while two luminous stellar rings glowed softly around the planet below. The advanced craft and the gentle planetary rings together formed a perfect harmony, a living testament to technology and nature coexisting. Up close, Nur shone like a jewel. Light refracted off its gemstone peaks and streaked the sky in layers of impossible color. "She is truly beautiful," Russ breathed, and for the first time he understood the words Harlan Ogilvy had once spoken to Malkador, words recorded in the Imperium's histories. "Terra is not as beautiful as Nur." "Brother," Russ said, meeting the other man's eyes, "I have seen countless worlds, and yours is the most beautiful." Doom straightened, a proud smile breaking across his face as he accepted the compliment. A splendid homeland was a thing to be proud of, and praise from a blood brother made it all the sweeter. "Fenris has its own kind of beauty," Russ added out of politeness, returning the favor. Doom waved a hand. "What beauty? A pile of ice and cold wind?" His tone was teasing, not unkind. No one could despise the world that raised them, Primarchs included. Fenris was a death world, harsh and relentless, but it forged the hardy Fenrisians. Russ felt nothing but pride for his home. I should prepare properly. It would be rude not to. As the ship made final approach to the newer ring, Russ excused himself fro Mem Doom and went to get ready for the formal visit. Coming to his brother's homeland, he wasn't treating this as a casual call. He'd made careful, deliberate preparations. Doom had wanted to keep the reception simple, but Russ insisted. For all his reputation for being unruly, Russ had a deep respect for newer traditions, especially their warrior code and the strict court etiquette that had grown up there. The Royal Majesty slipped into the newer dock with the scarred hull that showed its recent trials. The ship's damage drew attention at once. Messages of concern poured in, and Doom replied to them one by one. When that was done and the gangplank was lowered for Russ, he brightened at the sight of his brother. Doom looked impeccable. His golden hair was drawn up into a high ponytail, gleaming and neat. His sideburns were braided into small pigtails, each tipped with dangling ornaments. He wore the snow-white winter robe he'd worn at the banquet, a look Russ thought suited him so well that he, too, had chosen the same garment for the ceremony. Around Doom's throat hung a wolf-tooth necklace, the teeth fanned in a crescent, largest in the center and tapering to small points at the sides. Doom's eyes, sharp as a hunting hawk's, picked out the tiny Fenrisian runes carved along the wolf teeth, each mark a story, each tooth a ward. The necklace of fangs, set against the trophies of savage prey festooned at Russ's waist, completed the image of a born hunter. Russ himself wore a long robe that spoke of nobility, yet every ornament and talisman shouted of the wild. The two elements sat on him like a deliberate contradiction. Beneath the outward ferocity there was a cultivated order. The brutal visage and coarse gestures gave way, on closer inspection, to a refinement as fine as silk. Behind him, the Primarch's guard gleamed, armor burnished bright, trimmed with precious furs. The men of Fenris had unbuckled their helmets and tied them to their belts, letting their rugged faces show. Thick, reddish-brown hair fell to broad shoulders, beards bristled on square jaws. They could have stepped out of the oldest sagas, Viking warriors reborn. "Brother," Doom said softly, "take me to the world that raised you." Russ's mouth lifted in a quick, fierce smile. "Gladly." The two Primarchs rode the orbital elevator down from the newer ring to the surface. Doom had always kept teleportation as a private tool, something he did not reveal lightly. It was not that he mistrusted Russ. As the leader of the Nor worlds, he simply had to keep a few cards hidden. Every commander has secrets. Trust was no excuse for laying them all on the table. Russ, for his part, was no different. When they had fought together against the Rangdan, the great wolf had held his own mysteries close as well. Sophia of the 13th Company, listening in briefly to their channels, had caught only a flicker of those mysteries. Snarls and wolfish roars threaded through the comms. Doom did not press. He was not one to pry. He trusted his brother and assumed Russ was carrying a burden that could not be spoken aloud. Russ stood by the elevator's observation window and pointed down. "Is that where you grew up?" he asked. Below, the city lay pale as snow. Starlight washed over white buildings, the reflected glow braided together until the whole place seemed draped in a translucent silvery veil. The city below was pristine and flawless, so sacred in its quiet beauty that it might have come straight from the old myths, a true, holy city. Doom gazed down at the Guardian main domain, its buildings softened by a veil of light, and his voice carried a touch of pride. "The Guardian main domain, the cradle of warriors," he said. "Those white bricks and blue doors and windows aren't just decoration. They stand for the purity of the warriors and the indomitable spirit that rules this place." He realized he had never really seen the main domain from this angle before. He normally teleported straight in and out. From here, it looked even more magnificent, solemn, almost godlike in its stillness. "Every structure means something," he went on quietly to Russ. "Every hall tells a legend. Every fresco sings an epic. This is the warrior's realm, a record of past glory and the forge of future triumphs." He wasn't flattering the place just to impress. The architecture and layout of the Guardian main domain carried a long, unbroken heritage, and the warrior spirit it preserved had endured since the domain's founding. The white stone houses had spawned countless warriors. Glory seemed etched into every brick and sill. Each outwardly ordinary building carried the memory of a family's rise and fall across generations, and still stood as a testament to that honor. An empty house meant a line had died out, swallowed by history. Doom noticed something else this time. Beyond the high walls that had once kept the orcs at bay, new white houses had been raised along the outskirts of the Guardian main domain. A smile touched his lips. Relief and a quiet joy warmed him. New construction was a good sign. It meant the city's homes were full again, and that the remnants of Nur were no longer dwindling, but growing for the first time. Even after seeing the vastness of the universe and its countless peoples, the ones he cared for most were still the people of Nur. "The people here deserve respect." Russ nodded solemnly. He sounded heavier than usual as he spoke. "Living in comfort hasn't softened them. If anything, it's sharpened their resolve. They became unyielding and finally broke their shackles." Doom had told him Nur's history on the way to the Nor worlds, but seeing it with his own eyes made the story feel real. Russ couldn't help but praise the people again for their hard-won tenacity. Doom replied, "You'll get to see Nur's customs and traditions up close." They spoke as the orbital elevator slowed, descending toward a pristine white city visible through the observation window. When the doors opened, a red carpet threaded with gold lay ready to receive them. Lining the carpet were 100 Night Watch in white power armor trimmed with gold for the court ceremony, blue cloaks embroidered with emblems draped over their shoulders, each holding a banner with both hands, a formal, silent welcome for the arriving guests. Clang, clang, clang. Boot struck the deck as the Night Watch shifted to holding their banners in one hand. The flags snapped, fists clenched, and palms thumped chests in a heavy, iron ringing, the warrior's salute. Russ clicked his tongue under his breath. His face betrayed nothing, but he was quietly relieved he had prepared himself beforehand. Otherwise he'd have lost face today. The Space Wolves took the scene as solemnly as the Night Watch. They stood ramrod straight, not daring so much as a slackened shoulder. Even Fricky and Gary, the two great wolves, crouched at Russ's feet with their heads held slightly up, radiating a proud, regal presence. The Space Wolves' honor guard immediately returned the Night Watch's salute. A clear blast of horns cut the air. The Space Wolves answered with their own calls, cold as Fenris itself, and brown-haired, bearded warriors descended from the orbital elevator. Their armor gleamed, polished with whale oil, and they bore the Wolfhead Legion standard as they strode forward. 100 warriors had formed a single-file line along one side of the great hall, chests thrust forward. When everyone had taken their place, they turned in unison to face the night watch. "Welcome, honored guests from afar." A gentle male voice carried across the carpet. At the far end, Flano Novik stepped forward, left hand pressed to his chest in courtly fashion. His family and retainers mirrored the gesture, extending a formal welcome down the length of the red carpet. Doom leaned close and whispered, "Go." Russ nodded almost imperceptibly, lifted his head, and stepped onto the carpet. At his flank, Frecky and Gary rose and matched his pace, moving in perfect time with their brother. Behind the Primarch, the honor guard fell in, warriors standing proud, heads held high, their power armor trimmed with precious furs, weapons burnished to a razor edge. The 13 company captains came after them, immaculate and unbowed, feeling the eyes of the people of Nur upon them. For this moment, the Space Wolves laid aside their usual feral bearing. Where there was normally savage swagger, there was now a sober, measured dignity, an answered solemnity to the town's ceremony. Silence and respect settled over the assembled crowd as the procession advanced. Court ladies stepped forward from the gaps between the ranks of warriors, lifting the triumph baskets on their arms and scattering petals around the two Primarchs. A bright, welcoming choir filled the air with lively song. Leman Russ walked the red carpet, petals drifting onto his broad shoulders, his enormous frame unbowed as he reached the dais. "Leman Russ," he announced, his voice a deep, rolling war drum. The man before him, clad in ancient ceremonial armor, returned the greeting with a warm smile. "Flano Novik." Russ set his hand over his chest and gave a slight bow. Beside Flano, a queen in a red court gown, golden hair, a striking face, a crystal crown, curtsied. "Sola Klaus Novik." Russ lowered himself to one knee, took her right hand gently, and pressed his lips to it in the Fenrisian hand-kissing ritual. A younger voice then spoke, bright and clear. The girl lifted the hem of her blue skirt in a neat curtsy, emerald eyes alight with curiosity. "Luoshi Novik," she said, saluting the towering figure before her. Doom smiled as he looked at the girl. In the few years since Russ had last seen her, little Luoshi had grown into a 10-year-old. Russ went still, his knuckles unconsciously tightening. The moment he saw her, his chest had gone cold. The worry he'd felt on the ship had been justified. His brother had briefed him about their homeworld's customs and history during the voyage, and had mentioned family ties and the fact that he had 2 brothers, but he had never said anything about younger relatives. By Fenrisian tradition, when an elder met a younger family member, the elder was expected to present a gift to acknowledge the seniority, and Russ knew Doom took those obligations seriously. If Doom considered someone his kin, Russ understood that, by extension, they were his family too. "Child," Russ said softly, leaning down, "do you have any siblings?" The giant's question startled Luoshi, but she answered in a gentle voice, "I have a younger brother." "He followed the veteran warriors out among the stars," she added quickly, anxious to avert any misunderstanding. "He didn't mean to be rude by not coming to greet you." Doom felt the implications of Russ's question like a cold wind. He'd forgotten how children were regarded on Fenris, how elders were expected to pay special attention to them, and he worried that by leaving someone unmentioned, he might have put the guest in an awkward position. Russ smiled and explained as if to put them at ease. On Fenris, elders give gifts to the children. Then, turning his attention to Doom, he let his rough hand brush the girl's cheek and gave a conspiratorial wink. "It seems your uncle forgot to introduce you when he presented the family." Doom shifted his gaze away, sheepish. He'd indeed failed to fully understand Fenrisian etiquette. Luoshi straightened her expression and defended him without hesitation. "Uncle is very busy," she said earnestly. "You can't blame him for that." Russ laughed, amused by the girl's deadpan seriousness. "So cute," he said, turning to Luoshi. "Your uncle might have forgotten you, but I won't forget this gift." He flashed a grin, his sharp canines catching the light, then lifted a hand to his mouth. He hissed and winced, breath coming short as he set his jaw and yanked. A hand-clenched painful moment later, he held a small, pristine white tooth between finger and thumb. Russ sucked in a ragged breath and flexed his face to ease the sting. "Wolves," he barked, rising and planting himself before the assembled space wolves. He held the canine high. "Remember this token." At his command, the warriors dropped to one knee, eyes fixed on the tiny object in their gene father's hand. Under their solemn, reverent gaze, Russ crouched down to the girl and said softly, "This is for you and your brother, Luoshi." Russ swallowed a mouthful of blood, held the fang in his palm, and offered it to the girl. "So long as it doesn't violate human welfare," he said, "this can command the wolf pack." It was both an honor and a power. Great Wolf Russ was presenting one of his own fangs as a welcome gift to a new scion of his brother's house. "This is far too valuable," Flano protested, trying to refuse on their behalf, but Russ raised a hand to stop him. "Precisely because it's valuable, it belongs to my brother's family." Russ smiled. The bleeding in his mouth had already stopped. A Primarch's healing was prodigious. His missing fang would grow back before long. Luoshi did not take the tooth herself. Instead, she looked to Doom, knowing only her uncle could make this decision. Doom gave a slight nod, granting permission. It was, after all, an extraordinarily precious gift, one that could prove useful someday. It would add another layer of protection for the Novik family, and Russ's intentions were plain and honorable. With that, they could not refuse. "Thank you, sir." Luoshi extended her pale hands and took the dagger-shaped fang, feeling its heavy weight settle in her palm. "Don't be so formal," Russ said, his face falling into mild reproach. "I'm Doom's blood brother. Call me Uncle." Without waiting for a reply, he stooped, lifted Luoshi, and settled her comfortably on his broad shoulder. His forward, familiar gesture broke the room's stiff reserve and lightened the mood at once. "This way, please." Flano smiled, waved them on, and turned to lead the way. Doom gave Russ a brief nod of acknowledgement, and the two men followed, the small group making for the royal palace. As they walked down the royal palace avenue, Flano filled the air with explanations of Nur's culture and the arc of its history. Russ, with Luoshi perched on his shoulder, listened with a solemn expression, punctuating the account with appreciative nods. He seemed to absorb every detail, grave and attentive. Along the outer edges of the avenue, massive stone screens rose like silent sentinels. Their surfaces were carved with scenes from the past, battles and coronations, seasonal festivals, and quiet domestic moments. Each panel arranged into a sweeping, if magnificent tableau that told the story of the nation in stone. The procession passed beneath that long, engraved history, the clang of distant footsteps and the murmur of conversation mixing with the weight of those carved ages. They began with the rise of the Night Watch, moved on to the height of their power, and then lingered on quieter images, people staring up at the stars, dreaming of what might come next. Russ watched with keen interest. Nur's history was different from Fenris's. On Nur, everything was carefully recorded, every event laid out so that even yesterday felt immediate. Fenris, by contrast, passed its past down by word of mouth, names and deeds blurred into ballads and myths until the real people nearly became legends. Russ pointed at a figure carved in stone, something he had never seen before. The race in the relief had hairless heads, thick limbs, rough, simple clothing, and faces twisted with a kind of feral madness. The carving showed countless of them encircling a city, swarming against the Night Watch in a chaotic, brutal siege. "We call them greenskin orcs," Doom said, following Russ's finger. He explained with the sort of crisp clarity Nur's records always encouraged. "Barbaric and belligerent, part organism, part fungus in some ways, their biology is strange and resilient. They fight constantly, and they have a kind of gestalt field, the wag, that drives them into ever greater violence. And oddly enough, they have a rough but decent taste." Doom warned him not to let ordinary people eat orcs. Mortals who ingested large quantities of orc spores didn't get stronger. They underwent genetic mutation and slowly turned green. Russ thought that was fascinating. The universe was vast and strange, and he had never encountered anything as extraordinary as the greenskin orcs. "The War College e-library has a lot of material on them," Doom said. "You should read up." He urged his brother to prepare early. The Old One's creations did not simply vanish from the cosmos. Sooner or later, the Imperium would run into them, and the Primarchs and their legions would be the first to face the consequences. "I will study it," Russ promised solemnly. From Doom's account, he had grasped how dangerous the orcs could be in war. As they walked, Russ's curiosity got the better of him. He peppered Doom with questions about the scenes carved into the stone frieze they were following. Near the end of the sequence, he paused at one relief that caught his eye. Doom standing with an unusual greatsword raised toward the sky, his form suffused with brilliant light. All around him, Nightwatch spearmen fought with grim determination, holding the line against a tide of grotesque, nightmarish creatures. These monsters were like nothing he had ever seen. Even the old stone reliefs that showed them hinted at malice, but here that hatred was palpable. Some were hulking and muscle-bound, with bat-like wings and twisted horns, faces twisted in rage. Others moved with a sinister grace, four-armed and blasphemous. Still others were bloated as small hills, their bodies oozing sores and their lips split in obscene smiles. There were bird-like things with wings on their backs, clutching tongues of living fire. Countless variations, great and small, bared fangs and claws as they surged at the Nightwatch. The battle was terrifying. The demons pressed in on every side, throwing themselves against the Nightwatch and trying to surround Doom and his men. But despite the horror of the assault, the outcome was not hard to predict. His brother was still alive, and the Guardian main domain still stood in Nur. Just ordinary Xenos, Doom said, his eyes sweeping the murals. He gave a helpless little smile and shrugged. With a bit of artistic license. He sounded as if stating a fact, his expression unchanged, his tone faintly rueful, as if he were lamenting artists who'd let their imaginations run wild. Russ nodded slowly and let his gaze fall away from the carvings. Out of trust in his brother, he did not press the matter further, but he did not believe Doom. Russ was a Primarch of uncommon perception. He could rebuild the truth of an event from the smallest of clues. This vast carved frieze, more like a stone scroll, had told of legends and great deeds for generations, but it had never contained anything like these creatures. They did not feel like the product of human fancy. The monsters seemed to appear from nowhere, be driven off by Doom and the Nightwatch, and then vanish from the record as if erased. No human hand, relying on imagination or embellishment, could have produced the precise, terrible malice those figures radiated. Before he tore his eyes away, Russ forced the images into his memory. He burned the carved forms onto his retina and into his mind, vowing that he would never forget them. He didn't press for details. Instead, he asked his brother bluntly, "What's the fastest way to get rid of them?" "Swords and fire." Doom answered without hesitation. Swords and flame were the most effective against demons. After a brief pause, he added, "and psychic powers." That was all he allowed himself to say. Knowledge of chaos was a true taboo. Doom found himself in the same position as King Nawick, unwilling to reveal more, uncertain how his brother would react to talk of chaos. He had another concern as well. The Emperor had repeatedly ordered that Primarchs and Space Marines be kept ignorant of chaos. Doom didn't know the Emperor's exact motives, but the instruction had been given often enough to imply a reason. Besides, the fewer who knew about chaos and its lore, the less strength it could draw from that knowledge. "Swords, fire, psychic powers, huh?" Russ murmured, committing the methods to memory. Something in his beastly intuition told him the scenes carved on the stone wall were far from simple, and knowing how to deal with what they depicted could only be useful. They fell silent. Russ stopped asking questions, and Doom said no more. At that moment, Flano's somber voice broke the hush. "These are the old King Nawick and Queen Daisy," he said, indicating the statues at the end of the row. At the far end of Royal Palace Avenue, the lifelike figure of the old king sat on his throne, Queen Daisy standing beside him. Seeing them seemed to stir something in Doom. His brow tightened, and his face grew serious as he looked up at his parents' likenesses. Russ studied the carved faces. The king's countenance was imposing and regal, the queen's gentle and kind. He dropped to one knee, a quiet show of respect for his brother's parents, and bowed his head in long, silent mourning. Those mortal parents had raised the great soul inside his brother. He owed them his reverence. Luoshi slid down from his shoulder and stood beside him, mourning in her own way for her grandfather and grandmother. The space wolves trailing behind him came to a clattering halt, and in unison dropped to one knee beside their Primarch to honor his parents. The two great wolves, Frecky and Gary, lay flat on the flagstones with their ears down, making soft, mournful whimpers from their mouths and noses, as if they, too, grieved. After a brief period of solemn mourning, The procession moved on and entered the royal palace's ancient bluestone hall of the Guardian main domain. Doom felt a faint disorientation as he stepped back into the old hall. He had not been here in a long time. After Nur was unsealed, his office had shifted out to the newer ring to cope with a flood of new duties, and he had come to regard the palace with a complicated reluctance. The events of that year were etched into his memory, each detail of that day impossible to forget. Beside the throne stood a secondary chair reserved for Regent Flano, used to attend to urgent matters. People filled the hall, humans who had come from across Nur to pay their respects to the blood brother of King Nawik. They were well informed about the wider Imperium, familiar with the Master of Mankind and the 21 Primarchs. Everyone's eyes swung to the towering figure beside King Nawik, a man whose wild strength was tempered by a certain refined bearing, and to the two enormous wolves at his flanks. "The banquet begins," someone declared. With the principal guests assembled, Flano formally announced the start of the feast. A mermaid lifted her head and began to sing, her voice pure and incomparable, the most beautiful, most melodious song anyone there had ever heard. Heh, no, not really. The banquet began. People from every corner of the world came to meet the Emperor's scion and to pay their respects to the blood brothers of King Nawik. Hosts and guests alike relaxed and enjoyed themselves. The meeting of two cultures set off a lively exchange and sparked new ideas. Russ was at ease. He displayed superb political skill, quoting the classics and debating philosophy with an ease that made his status seem effortless. The Primarch's unusual wisdom and natural charisma won the admiration of everyone present. The Great Wolf was not surprised. As a Primarch, he did naturally outstrip ordinary men, but he showed no arrogance. Physical gifts alone did not equal true wisdom or prescience. At the level of the soul, Primarch and mortal were not so different. When the formal greetings had ended, Russ drifted to the glass tank and studied the mermaid inside. He had never seen anything like her. In the old human legends, mermaids were known for fair faces and beguiling, seductive voices. Yet seeing one up close made the stories feel both real and strangely insufficient. What lay before him matched the legends. The mermaid was not only breathtakingly beautiful, but her song poured out like something not of this world. Russ had slipped away to look for himself, and when he returned, satisfied and a little stunned, Doom explained the creature's origins and history. The account left Russ more astonished than the mermaid's face had. What had been called the Dark Age of technology revealed a cruelty beneath its brilliance that a Primarch born of war found particularly abhorrent. Men, armed with wonders of science, had acted with the arrogance of gods. They exterminated those who opposed them and remade living things and matter to suit their designs. After a long silence, Russ finally asked a blunt, oddly practical question that made Doom pause. Is the mermaid oviparous, viviparous, or ovoviviparous? Doom's mouth twitched. His eyes flicked toward the woman still singing in the hall. He did not have the nerve to put the question to her, and though Russ thought about it for some time, curiosity gnawing at him, he too let the matter drop. A modest welcome feast followed, filling the normally quiet palace with laughter and music until night. Russ slept soundly that night and did not stir until the sun was high. When he finally woke, it was already noon. The two brothers walked together into the newer ring. Since leaving Fenris, Russ admitted he had never slept well in unfamiliar places. As they strolled through the ring-shaped eco-city, Russ stretched, eyes still heavy with sleep, and sighed. Even at the Imperial Palace on Terra, I hardly ever sleep, he said. Old Malkador hates to see us idle. He's always slipping more work on our plates. Doom gave a sympathetic nod. And when I do sleep, I never wake naturally. I'm always being pulled awake by trivial matters, or my own stress keeps me from resting. He shrugged. That's why whenever I go to Terra, I leave as soon as my business is done. I don't stay longer than I have to. Russ clasped his hands behind his head and looked up at the dome overhead, annoyance creasing his features. Doom's expression agreed with his words. Malkador never seemed willing to let go of any high-value task. Doom himself had even been assigned to the Department of the Interior once. The old man was fond of him, praising the broad vision a Primarch educated in a regular court could bring to policy. Every time Doom saw the mountains of documents waiting to be read, his scalp tingled. He was grateful, all the same, to Sophia. Because of the central law, he was largely spared the misery of endless office work, a relief he quietly appreciated as they walked on. If Doom ran things the way the Imperium did, tied to bureaucracy and expansion, he would have had little time to rest. Instead, he and Russ preferred a slower pace. They strolled to the ring-shaped palace, talking as two enormous wolves padded beside them. Russ welcomed the reprieve. Officially, he had a year of preparations ahead of him. In practice it was leave, a chance to recover properly. The Space Wolves fleet was scattered across several Forge worlds for refit and upgrades, and he knew he might need to keep an eye on the work. Still, this was the Nor worlds, a network of highly capable, human-led systems. He did not have to do everything himself. When they entered the palace hall, the polished floor split open to reveal a table that rose up between two large chairs. They sat, and a holographic projection bloomed above the table, a detailed scan of the Space Wolves fleet. During a brief warp passage, the fleet had reached a Forge world and completed its diagnostics. The projection showed Nur's proposals, an itemized schedule of repairs, structural reinforcements, and firepower upgrades the Nor worlds could deliver within a year. Hull schematics rotated, weapon hardpoints were highlighted, and timetables scrolled in crisp light. Russ examined the plans closely. A faint gold glow flared in his eyes as he took in the scope of the work, exact, ambitious, and exactly what the Space Wolves needed. Today, Russ's long-standing wish was finally granted. For the first time, he experienced the convenience of Nor world's technology firsthand. A few operations in, he already understood how it worked. It was basically an assembly game. Pick a modification scheme, apply it to the chosen ship, and watch the changes take effect. He was in high spirits, marveling at the Nor world's ingenuity and sneering at the Adeptus Mechanicus. For a similar level upgrade, the Mechanicus would schedule endless meetings and then produce a stripped-down plan. The red-robed priests would intone with all the pious arrogance of dogma. The spaceship is the conquering will of the Omnissiah and cannot be altered at will. The plan his brother Nur had provided was the maximum level modification available. Given more time, Nur could have designed even more radical retrofits, enough to completely rebirth the warships. Doom leaned back in his chair and watched Russ choose with a smile, remembering his own thrill at playing hologames. "Thank you for your generosity," Russ said, though his face was serious. He bent over the interface and began selecting modification plans for each warship with focused care. Doom did not interrupt. He only picked up the briefing he'd missed while away and began to quietly flip through it. The conference hall was unusually still, lit only by the faint glow of holographic displays. After a few moments of study, he nodded to himself. The Nor worlds were expanding at a moderate but steady rate. It wasn't that the conquest fleet was slow, rather, the timetable he had laid out from the start intentionally capped the pace of annexation. The Nor domain was organized into three principal zones: the core, the controlled, and the influenced territories. The core, centered on Nur, was a spherical region with a radius of 200 light-years, encompassing Nur's home system. From 200 to 500 light-years lay the controlled territory, a more distant band kept under firm, direct Nor authority. From 500 to 1,000 light-years, and often beyond, stretched the influenced territory, where Nor power was limited to political, economic, and cultural sway. The vast distances made construction of a reliable quantum communications network slow and difficult. For now, the main thrust of conquest was the controlled territory. The objective was clear: bring every strategically valuable world within that band fully under Nor rule. The ring-shaped, three-dimensional region, some 300 light-years across, held billions of stars and untold planets. Alien species and lost human homeworlds alike dotted the vastness. Nor's 1,000 exploration ships were barely a drop in that ocean. Doom's strategy was simple. Within the controlled territory, every conquered world had to establish its own governing organs. Local administrations would restore production, shoulder responsibilities within the Nor system, and prevent planets from sliding back into famine and chaos. As the conquest advanced, Nor also rolled out a quantum communications network across the controlled territory. With fast, reliable links, Sophia could monitor planets in real time, allocate resources, and set production quotas. Sensible distribution of material and labor cut waste, kept subordinate worlds productively employed, and stabilized economies. The trade-off was speed. This approach slowed the pace of conquest, but it ensured durable control over each newly subjugated world. The recently liberated populations were gradually coming to accept Nor rule. It would only take a generation or two before most pledged their loyalty outright. In the influenced territories, meanwhile, the strategy remained cautious. Secure only high-value worlds for now, and erect dozens of fortress systems to serve as bridgeheads for future offensives. The fleets under Li Tang, Harlan, and Senna had built an imposing reputation, hundreds of major worlds conquered, countless resource worlds identified and marked. Smaller squadrons led by the Night Watch Masters were posting their own notable successes. Data scrolled across Doom's displays in an unending stream, and he couldn't hide his satisfaction. There was a permanent smile on his face. His orders had not been wasted. The conquest fleet had delivered. Within the controlled territories, 28 worlds converted to agriculture were shipping out enough food to feed every system, ensuring no one went hungry. In some lost worlds ravaged by famine, a single proper meal was enough to win the locals over to Nor's rule. Force remained the last resort. Winning hearts was the preferred tactic. Feed the hungry, bring hope to the desperate, and liberate the oppressed. They had taken one world after another without bloodshed, using measured, pragmatic methods. Nur's fleet and administrative system imposed a kind of relative fairness, not the absolute justice Doom would have liked to promise, because he knew he simply didn't have the power to guarantee that. Still, this new order made life on those conquered worlds hundreds of times better than it had been. From time to time, a few elites from the old era tried to stage uprisings, but those seizures were isolated and lacked popular support. Before formal security forces could even mobilize, enraged militiamen usually had the ringleaders in custody. Finally, it's done. Russ's voice broke through the console hum while Doom skimmed through the latest reports. He was in a better mood than Doom had seen lately. He'd just finished selecting the fleet upgrade plans. By my estimate, the refitted fleet's combat capability will increase several-fold. 234. Cunning Wolf. Before coming to Nur, Russ would never have imagined the fleet's combat effectiveness could be multiplied several times over. That wasn't hyperbole. The combination of greater range and vastly improved maneuverability created an entirely new tactical system. Doom brought up the holographic display and studied Russ's refit plan closely. Reinforced force field struts toughened each hull, improving durability and resistance to sustained bombardment. A full complement of agile auxiliary thrusters gave even capital ships much tighter turning ability. More advanced weapon systems raised the fleet's firepower by 50%, extending engagement ranges and cutting reload times. Upgraded plasma drives met the ship's growing power demands and significantly increased their endurance in combat. Those core component changes alone transformed the fleet. Dozens of smaller modifications stacked on top of them, and together produced the dramatic, several-fold boost in combat power. Perhaps because of his time aboard Nur's ships, Russ seized the chance to improve conditions for his crew. The indentured laborers, too, saw some relief. After reviewing the plans, Doom called Sophia. The Grand Steward's ethereal blue form shimmered into being, and he ordered at once, "Begin work. Complete the ship modifications as quickly as possible." Estimated completion, 10 Terra months, Sophia answered with precise calm, her eyes flashing. Russ nodded. 10 months was a testament to the terrifying productivity of his brother's domain. The refit would not be limited to the vessels already at Nur. It would also cover additional ships being sent from Forge worlds across the Imperium to reinforce the fleet. The Wolf King's heart swelled. Fighting alongside his brother and striking hard at the Xenos would bring immense honor, and, more importantly, would increase the fleet's combat power. Honor was precious, but often ephemeral. In the end, it was the firepower of their warships that would make that honor real. Russ's satisfied look didn't go unnoticed by Doom, who returned the smile, but said nothing. The plan Sophia had laid out, and the technology it used, represented the absolute limit of what could be done with external modifications. What it did not touch was the true core tech, and that was by design. Doom had explicitly forbidden any release of the core technology. He meant to preserve Nur's technological edge. It wasn't simple stinginess or a refusal to help. Given the current state of humanity, indiscriminate sharing would only spark worse conflicts. There was also the problem of the Adeptus Mechanicus, the red-robed zealots who fetishized technology. If Nur exposed advanced techniques, those priests would be able to anoint them as the work of an omnissiah one day and accuse the Nor worlds of heresy the next. The Mechanicus would then move to monopolize and lock away the knowledge, outlaw its circulation, and in doing so, poison the broader future of humanity. For that reason, any use of the technology had to remain tightly controlled and closely supervised. In the Nor worlds, Sophia could guarantee the security of their technology. Outside those controlled zones, however, the risks were incalculable. "Be careful of the Adeptus Mechanicus," Doom warned, teasing Russ as he offered an early heads-up. The tech priests handled the production and upkeep of nearly the entire Imperial fleet. Even the Space Wolves' upgraded ships would ultimately fall under their care. Doom didn't really fear a leak. He was just enjoying the chance to needle his brother. The upgrades Russ had in mind didn't change the underlying designs, only the manufacturing methods and the tolerances. Once the components were installed, the tech priests would figure out it was a matter of superior manufacturing, not a different technical lineage. "What should I do then?" Russ asked, anxiety flashing across his face. He scratched at his ear, clearly struggling. Doom suppressed a smile at the sight. Then Russ's golden eyes brightened. He snapped his finger, Ars, and clapped his hands together. He'd thought of a solution. "Tell me." Doom leaned forward, curiosity piqued. Russ's grin widened. He was clearly pleased with himself. "Do you know about Tech Marines?" Doom did. He knew the basics. Tech Marines traced back to the Olympus Accord, the compact between the Emperor and the machine cult of Mars. Under that pact, each legion sent a number of its warriors to Mars to be schooled in the principles of machinery and machine spirit. When they returned, those men maintained tanks, engines, and the great arcane engines of war the legions relied on. It was a sensible arrangement, and in practice it kept the legions fighting. But Tech Marines were never fully accepted. The Adeptus Mechanicus taught through ritual as much as through engineering. To be instructed, you had to venerate the omnissiah. Technology and faith were braided together. So the Tech Marines came back not only armed with servo tools and cipher knowledge, but wearing the red livery and augmetic harnesses of the Mechanicum. That outward devotion, praised the omnissiah raised between volleys of bolter fire, sat oddly among the thunder of Astartes' battle cries. In the charge, when a battle brother bellowed the name of his Primarch or the Emperor as he stormed forward, a Tech Marine's pious exclamation from the flank felt, to many, like an awkward intrusion. Their usefulness was never doubted, their status was. After the war ended, the Legion Hall filled with the loud post-battle clamor of brothers trading stories. In a corner, the Tech Marines sat apart, murmuring binary to their machines as if in prayer. They were the ones who kept the Legion fighting, yet for a dozen reasons they had always been outsiders. Across the Imperium, an Astartes, who took the rights of a Tech Marine, closed off his path to command. Primarchs and Legion high commands refused to elevate those who had been touched by Martian ways. The fear was simple and absolute. If a Tech Marine ever rose to high rank, would he bring the Adeptus Mechanicus with him and Martianize the Legion? No one could answer that for certain, so the solution had been blunt. Snuff out the possibility entirely and seal the Legion against the spread of Mechanicus doctrine. Within the Stars Accord, the Nor world's provision of technical talent to the Imperium is strictly limited, Russ recited. Doom gave a slow shake of his head, amusement flickering in his eyes as he dismissed Russ's suggestion. There was a loophole. Nor could not openly export technicians, but nothing in the Accord forbade them from receiving Imperials sent there for study. Sophia had deliberately left many loopholes in the Stars Accord, small exceptions to keep it from becoming too restrictive. Russ snorted, eyes flicking, and said coolly, "What if I just buy weapons from Nur and learn to use them from the manuals that come with them?" "Do you really think those red-robed zealots are going to show up and openly investigate us?" Doom asked, staring at Russ. His gaze felt like it reached inside him, sizing up his brother. The idea was petty enough that anyone might have thought of it, but it was almost shameful to hear a Primarch voice it so plainly. The two Wolf brothers turned away, pretending not to notice. Under Doom's examining stare, Russ's weathered face went a little red. He scratched at his cheek and tried to keep his composure. Doom didn't press the point. There was something else in Russ's tone he'd already picked up on. "You still want weapons?" he asked. "Yes." Russ rubbed his hands together, a grin spreading across his face like a market hawker's. He rattled off his list without hesitation. 1,000,000 bolters, 100,000 plasma pistols, 50,000 melta weapons, 10,000 assorted power weapons, and 1 billion bolter rounds. Doom's thick brows drew together as he studied Russ, as if silently asking, "Are you serious?" Nur could certainly manufacture that arsenal, but the political fallout would be enormous. Nur itself wouldn't care, but the Space Wolves had no forge world, no industrial base of their own. They depended entirely on Imperial provisioning. And where did Imperial supplies come from? Mars. The Adeptus Mechanicus on Mars would make a very public fuss if they discovered the Space Wolves were taking weapons from Nur. There was a difference, Doom pointed out, between Nur upgrading the Space Wolves' ships out of Brotherhood and Nur openly trading weapons. Upgrading ships was an act of kinship, not an economic transaction. Selling arms changed the nature of the relationship. Russ spread his hands and gave a devilish smile. "My brother sends me weapons, and I send my brother resources." "Is that too much?" Russ asked. Doom rolled his eyes and gave a disbelieving laugh. "Do you think they'll buy that?" Russ met his look with a stubborn set to his jaw. "I don't know if they'll buy it. It's enough if I do." He had already made up his mind. This shipment of weapons had to be secured. The Legion needed the edge. The Imperial arms forged in his brother's domain showed, on paper, at least a 30% advantage over comparable Martian models, and that statistic alone was enough to drive him. Doom, seeing Russ was resolved, didn't press the point. Instead, he asked, curiosity winning out, "What will you trade for so many weapons?" The Space Wolves don't have any forge worlds or steady revenue. Nur doesn't even take Imperial coin. You're left with industrial raw materials at best. "You don't need to worry about that," Russ said, patting his chest. "I've worked it all out. I can pay. I can produce goods of equivalent value." Doom hesitated, but in the end he nodded and agreed to the trade. In a galaxy this vast, it wasn't unheard of for the Space Wolves to keep private stores. Still, the quantity of weapons his brother wanted far exceeded the Legion's standard complement, and Doom couldn't help asking, "What do you plan to do with so many weapons?" Russ's face went grave. "Stockpile them." 235. Liquidation. Store them away. Doom shook his head at the absurdity of that explanation, but the notion suddenly began to make sense. Canine animals stashed food when it was plentiful to survive lean seasons. Leman Russ, as a Primarch with canine genes woven into him, could easily have picked up the same instinct. He didn't want to pry into why Russ felt the need to hoard, not when the truth was so obvious. Even if the pile of weapons seemed enormous, it would be difficult to find enough men, or even Marines, to fully arm. Still, another possibility nagged at him. Doom fixed Russ with a suspicious look and asked, unconsciously lowering his voice, "You planning to resell them?" Buying that many weapons at once had only one clear explanation. They were meant for profit. Space Marine arms were built to last, centuries, even tens of thousands of years in some cases, but nothing was eternal. The Imperium of Man was stirring back to life, and the null stars were being restructured technologically. Progress would keep marching forward. What was cutting-edge today would grow obsolete tomorrow, eventually being phased out altogether. If Russ intended to cash in before those advances rendered the hardware worthless, the plan made cold, practical sense. It was an ugly thought, but in Doom's line of work, pragmatism often wore a cruel face. Apart from the idea of trafficking arms for profit, Doom's quick mind searched for any other motive, then came up empty. He could think of nothing that would better explain his brother's actions. Perhaps he allowed himself, seeing the Novik family's enormous profits from Nur's fine wines had given Russ the idea. If Nur could be so lucrative, why not resell weapons to build a private fortune for the Space Wolves? The more Doom turned it over in his head, the more plausible that explanation became. There was another, deeper thread running between them. The two had recently argued about the future of humanity. Doom had been blunt. The long-term fate of mankind did not lie with post-human warriors, but with ordinary mortals. Russ had bristled at the suggestion, and the conversation had grown heated. Yet Doom's case, rooted in the hard realities of the Imperium, had left him without answer. Doom had not hidden his plans. He told Russ that once his campaign succeeded and he finally retired, Nur would be returned to mortal governance, placed once more under the Novik family. Russ reacted with alarm. If the Emperor and the Primarchs withdrew, what would become of the legions of Space Marines? These were Astartes, the very force that had conquered the galaxy. How could they be expected to lay down their arms and return to civilian life? Doom gave no clear answer. He didn't know what the Emperor ultimately planned for the Space Marines, and he would not pretend otherwise. Wars did not end with the galaxy finally conquered, he said. They ended when the four gods were destroyed. What would become of the Space Marines after that? Doom couldn't say. It was too soon to speculate. Russ stared at him in disbelief, slapping his bare chest and swearing an oath. "How could I be that kind of man?" he barked. "I would never stoop to it. I loathe those profit-minded merchants. To act like them would bring shame on the Legion." He meant it when he said it, but inwardly his thoughts were different. He planned to keep the weapons they had bought. Selling them was out of the question. They were the Space Wolves' safeguard. Though he protested aloud, beneath the words, Russ found himself quietly agreeing with Doom's logic. The Space Marines might one day be withdrawn from the stage. If the Emperor allowed them to fade away naturally with age, so much the better. Few would mourn the end of an era, and the Space Wolves could live with that arrangement. Mutual destruction was out of the question. The Emperor would not be so reckless as to pit his legions against one another. The likeliest outcome, Doom believed, was exile, deployment of the Space Marines into the black beyond the galaxy, a slow death among the Thumpor stars. Those sealed weapons would be his parting gift for any who survived the journey. Primarchs were not people who waited for fate. When they sensed something inevitable, they prepared for it. Doom had done exactly that. He had already told Flano what he expected and how he intended to act. Russ, trusting his brother's assessments and running his own calculations, had begun putting plans in motion on his end. So be it. Doom cut off any further speculation. He waved a hand toward the empty expanse of the Great Hall and addressed the unseen presence there. "Sophia, compute the exchange materials and provide our Great Wolf with a list." Russ brightened at the command. The deal was effectively sealed. A list materialized before him. He examined it carefully and then allowed himself a satisfied smile. The items and quantities matched his expectations almost exactly, and the cost was well within the Space Wolves' means. They can be produced now. Russ lounged back in his chair, arms folded behind his head. For the first time in hours, the hard lines of his face softened. When he smiled, his teeth, newly regrown, flashed with a cold, bright gleam. The preparations for the Null Stars had been finished, every checklist crossed off, and at last there was time to rest. Doom watched him and smiled. Nur's calm had settled over his brother, and something like pride warmed Doom's chest. Terra was the cradle of humanity, yet most of the Primarchs, save Horus, spoke of it with something close to fear. Whenever a Primarch returned to Terra, it was Malkador who breathed easiest. He could finally let himself rest. "Do you play chess?" Doom asked, and tapped a control on the table. The surface slid open to reveal a set of intricately interlaced boards, their grids crossing into one another like a woven lattice. "Rules," Russ said without preamble, straightening instantly. A holographic projection rose from the table and outlined the game's conventions. An image flashed across Russ's retina, and in a single instant, the pattern of play became clear. The rules of Go, an ancient game from Old Terra, laid bare. He understood them, as if he had always known. After a brief nod of mutual recognition, the two settled at the chessboard and began to spar, testing each other's strategic wits. They traded victories back and forth, probing openings, parrying feints, and smiling at one another as each counterplay was met. Doom enjoyed the quiet duel. On Nur, he was rarely bested, A Primarch's computational mind crushed most opponents, and Russ's presence pleased him, offering the rare satisfaction of a worthy match. Clack, clack, clack. The sound of pieces being set down rang through the royal hall as the two played with brisk, practiced hands. Not long after, two figures appeared at the entrance, flanked by the Night Watch. The visitors Doom had been expecting had finally arrived. A modulated mechanical voice and a clear female tone spoke in unison, offering their salutations. Avev, Great Primarch, the Omnissiah is with you. Greetings, Great Primarch, may the stars be with you. The speakers were the Mechanicus sage, summoned by Sophia's warning, and the rogue trader Sophia had chosen. Together they entered the royal hall to stand before the two chess-playing Primarchs. The Mechanicus sage gave the cog salute. The rogue trader dropped to one knee and returned a warrior's salute. Doom barely glanced at them. His eyes were fixed on the chessboard before him, and in a voice that brooked no argument, he said, "Rise." Russ paid the entrance no mind. He knew Nur's internal politics were not his concern, and had no intention of interfering. Doom, however, remained absorbed in the game. As he said a piece with deliberate slowness, he spoke again, his tone measured. "Sage, please address me." The Mechanicus sage rested a hand on the Forge Axe emblem, denoting his rank, and inclined his head in a careful, almost reverent bow. Beneath the red hood, the small mechanical servos in his skull trembled. His cranial chip ran calculations to parse what the lore D of the stars intended by summoning him. The pressure of that computation overloaded the sage's emotional module. Cold sweat beaded and trailed down a face otherwise kept immaculate by augmetics. The old human feeling of fear, supposedly purged by his mechanical systems, flickered back into being. Doom's posture and the weight behind his summons made the message clear. This Primarch was already aware of the recent disturbances in the gate system, and he regarded Mars and Meg's actions with open disapproval. The sage felt that disapproval keenly, and for the first time in a long while, the Mechanicus found himself answering not only with protocol, but with something very much like dread. "I hope you will consider this carefully." The Mechanicus sage's voice, mechanical and lined with static, trembled as the servos hissed while he weighed each word. "Consider what?" Doom cut in, calm and blunt. "I assume whatever Mars does has been well considered. If the Forge Masters and Sages of Mars have already thought this through on my behalf, then I have no objection," Doom went on. "The Null Stars will erect a large trading station in the void beside Mars, selling Titans and other heavy war machinery." "That's brilliant," Russ barked, clapping his hands as he sat cross-legged in the chair. "Space Wolves ought to have their own Titan Legion." White smoke curled from the red robe at the sage's collar. His internal heat sinks whined and faltered, and his logic threads began to stutter. His calculations ran, and the conclusion was unambiguous. Doom was telling the truth, and he meant to do it. "We'll withdraw the trading platform immediately." The Mechanicus sage answered without hesitation, his mechanical appendages quivering with restrained efficiency. He had occupied his post long enough to know when compromise was the only option. If the Null Stars sent Titans and other war engines into the field, the hit to the Adeptus Mechanicus's profits would be catastrophic. Inwardly, he spat a string of binary curses at Mars for forcing such an irrational decision. Running late, 1 chapter left. Brothers, it's been really tough. Chapter 236, Rogue Trader. Since the Star Cluster Protocol was signed, Mars had been riven by endless, heated council meetings. The Mechanicus sages fumed, demanding the Forge General's resignation and accusing him of betraying the planet's interests. The Forge General answered with a single, fatal line. "If any of you can do better than I have, step forward and take my place." That shut them up. They all understood. There simply was no feasible alternative that would preserve Mars's position. Their righteous outrage had been a mask, a bargaining posture to extract greater concessions for their factions. Still, to give the appearance of displeasure, someone proposed a conveniently theatrical solution. Build an Adeptus Mechanicus space station in the gate world of the Null Stars and sell the exact same wares as Nur. Not to make money, but as a deliberate provocation, an insult designed to needle the Null Stars and reclaim lost prestige. A few cautious voices warned that Nur would retaliate swiftly and harshly, but they were shouted down. How arrogant the Mechanicus had become, face had to be saved, no matter the cost. At first, the plan went ahead as if nothing could go wrong. At Gate World's trading hub, every time Nur brought something new to market, the Adeptus Mechanicus was never far behind with a rival product. They couldn't match Nur's craftsmanship, but their wares were cheaper. The rogue traders, rootless and profit-driven, favored the lower price over loyalty or quality. Nur had deliberately taken short-term losses to build a reputation. The move had won him public praise. Now that gamble had finally drawn retribution. It came like thunder, sudden, absolute, leaving no room for negotiation. Doom, the Primarch, lifted a chess piece and made his move, continuing the game with Russ as if nothing else mattered. "I don't think you need to evacuate," he said. For a moment, the Mechanicus sage allowed himself to hope. Surely the Primarch would spare the station? Doom's next sentence erased that hope. "Your personnel may evacuate," he continued, his voice level, "but you will leave the space station and all stored goods behind. All merchandise currently in transit must be brought here, and you will surrender 10 resource worlds as compensation for our losses." Doom's calm words had the weight of a lion's low roar. The Mechanicus sage felt it in his bones and trembled. "I need to discuss this with Mars." He bowed his head once more, requesting a brief leave. "You may." Doom inclined his head and signaled assent, then added quietly, "If they do not agree, Nur will increase its current production capacity." The Mechanicus sage flinched. The cybernetic appendages beneath his red robe twitched faster, and the comm module grafted into his body pinged the ship moored at the gate, requesting instructions from Mars via astropathic communication. He had been stationed on Gate World for many years and knew the politics of the Null Stars intimately. Within Nur's core territories lay 36 Forge Worlds, holding an enormous cache of perfectly preserved STC templates. To satisfy both wartime needs and civilian industry, only 6 of those Forge Worlds would need to be brought online. If the Null Stars decided to expand production, they would inevitably begin producing and selling war machines to the Imperium, direct, dangerous competition for Mars. The Star Cluster Protocol had been explicit. The Adeptus Mechanicus would supply STCs to Nur, and the Null Stars would provide limited armaments to the Imperium to protect the Mechanicus' interests. But the agreement also forbade the Mechanicus from trampling on the Null Stars' holdings within Imperial space, and that restriction hung over every action the tech priests took in the gate system. Selling goods through rogue traders was a deliberate maneuver, a way to avoid overt breach of the treaty while still profiting from trade, a legal gray area that blurred the treaty's intent. "I will relay your words," the Mechanicus sage said, and hurried away. He wanted a decision from Mars before he, Primarch, could turn up the pressure. The sage was convinced Mars would seek a compromise. He only needed authorization from the Forge General. The Forge General would not risk severing ties with the Null Stars over 10 resource worlds. It would be ruinous for both sides. The outburst had been made, and the Primarch had been chastened. There was nothing more to gain here. When the Mechanicus sage left, Doom set the chess piece down and swiveled his chair to face the woman who had been waiting below. "My apologies, madam." He offered a courteous smile, the sort of apology a gentleman might give a lady. "I neglected you just now." "You need not apologize. To behold the Primarch's radiance is honor enough for me and the family behind me." The woman knelt on one knee, her voice thick with feeling as she spoke. Doom nodded slowly, his gaze appraising the rogue trader Sophia had chosen. A flash of approval crossed his face. She wore Gothic finery, her waist painfully cinched by a corset, a ceremonial scimitar hanging at her hip. She was no longer young, but still retained an imposing presence. Skin softened with age, heavy makeup, white foundation, vivid crimson lips, dark, dramatic eyeshadow, and a proud, unbowed posture. Her white hair was arranged in an elaborate coiffure, and her amber eyes betrayed not a hint of timidity. Her identification blinked up before Doom, Victoria Legner, Queen of the Legner family. He inclined his head and addressed the kneeling woman. "You're a small rogue trader house, but your family has an impeccable record in the Gate World's ledgers. Never once defaulted," the Primarch said. "Because of that reputation, your transaction volume is unusually high for a house your size, even if you haven't yet converted that into greater expansion." He nodded at Lady Victoria with a satisfied, almost paternal look. I believe such credibility should be rewarded. Victoria felt a tremor run through her. Tears pricked her eyes. Years of insisting on honesty and steadiness felt suddenly vindicated. Look at this shipping lane, the Primarch continued. A miniature galaxy flickered into being before her, a shimmering hollow map that traced the great star rivers. From the halo stars, a single shipping lane ran like a bright thread straight to the Sol system, to humanity's throne world, Terra. This is... Victoria couldn't finish. She had navigated the star rivers before, but confronted with a direct route to Terra, she felt like a green cadet on her first voyage. The realization hit her in the chest. Her family's steadfastness had earned them something rare and priceless. I have heard a great deal from my brothers, Doom said calmly. The goods from Nur, after changing hands a few times, are being marked up by billions. I find that unacceptable. Russ's expression darkened. They'll inflate the price on a single crate of wine until it pays for an entire transport ship, he added, voice bitter as if remembering those profiteers. So I intend to open a shipping lane to Terra, Doom continued, to move Nur's produce at stable prices. I will, of course, leave a reasonable profit margin for the Legner family. His gaze was hard and direct, as if trying to read the woman before him. Can the Legner family take on that route? Ever since he learned of the outrageous markups, Doom had been determined to do something for the common people. Nur's agricultural world produced far more than it could consume. Warehouses were multiplying, crops rotting in storage. Rather than let the harvests pile up, it made more sense to export them so people on poorer worlds would have enough to eat. Terra, humanity's political and cultural heart, still had a very large impoverished population. The last time he had been there, the population had already topped 700 billion and was still growing. As the Great Crusade carried on, ever more people flooded Terra, trying any trick they could to stay. At the planetary exit points, the items most thoroughly inspected were the little clods of Terran soil that people hid in their palms or stew fed into backpacks. In the underhives of the great hive cities, the poor huddled together by the millions, every day more starved to death. One of Malkador's constant worries was how to secure the immense quantities of water and food the planet now required. Terra had no oceans, no functioning water cycle. The very idea of open seas had been forfeited to a demon by some old night warlord long ago. Doom's plan was ruthlessly simple. Sell wine and other luxuries to Terra's nobles, they never lacked coin, and use the proceeds to offset the losses from grain transport, restoring balance to the shipping lanes. He wasn't being altruistic. His aims were practical. Relieve the Null Star's mounting stock pressure, drive down sky-high prices to choke off smuggling, and, as a useful side effect, help Malkador address some of Terra's immediate shortages. Thank you for the Primarch's favor. The Legner family will not fail your expectations. Lady Victoria pressed a fist to her chest, her voice steady as she accepted the commission. She knew the family's rise or fall hinged on this one move. She had to seize it. Confronted with such profit, can the Legners keep to their principles? Only time will tell. Doom raised his hand and took a rolled parchment from a courtier, a trading agreement drafted long ago. Let me see. Russ suddenly stood, snatched the scroll, and read it with intense focus. Doom was taken aback by the gesture but said nothing. Russ's actions always carried their own intent. Bring a pen, Russ ordered the courtier. She handed him a quill. He bit its shaft, ink smudging his lips, and then wrote briskly, adding several lines to the document. When he nodded in satisfaction and stepped back to present it, Doom inspected the changes and could only smile wryly. Russ had amended the terms to favor the rogue trader fleet's convenience. In effect, if Fenris ordered supplies from Nur, the fleet would be the one to deliver them. It was a harmless concession. Fenris lay at the edge of the Sol system, so the fleet would not have to make a warp jump, only slip into and back out of real space. In return, the Space Wolves agreed to detach 100 Battle Brothers to provide security for the Legner family fleet. It was non-negotiable. Russ had already signed. Doom set his name to the parchment as well. The matriarch of the Legner house, Victoria, was handed the scroll next, the gesture unmistakable. Her signature was expected. Victoria drew a ceremonial longsword from her hip. cut the palm of her hand, and pressed it down onto the vellum. Blood soaked the trading agreement as she spoke the rogue trader's oath with iron conviction. Doom inclined his head at her resolve, then warned in a colder tone, "Do not forget today's oath. If you break this agreement, the Legner family will answer for it." "Never forget." Victoria's voice was as hard as steel. Inwardly she thought, "Black Uncle is here." 237. There will always be a farewell. The lady signed the trade agreement, bowed once, and left the palace hall with the formal grace expected of her station. The Legner family would now be responsible for opening a trade route that would span star systems. With profits this vast, they would have to assemble a convoy fleet to protect shipments from disruption. That, however, was hardly beyond them. Rogue traders operated under well-established codes. Through negotiations, alliances, and profit-sharing deals, they could raise a private fleet in short order. Merchants lived for profit, and this pact would turn the Legners into a rising power almost overnight. With fortune, though, came risk. Being named the designated merchant between two empires and reaping the resulting windfall would draw every covetous eye in the sector. Fortunately, they were not alone. The backing of 2 Primarchs and Space Marines sent by the Space Wolves would be a strong deterrent against pirates and brigands. Doom assigned the necessary tasks and then took a deliberately hands-off approach. There would be plenty for others to worry about. After all, there will always be a farewell. To a rogue trader, a single trade pact could be enough to whip up a storm and reshuffle entire houses. To a Primarch, such minor disturbances rarely warranted more than a passing thought. Perspective depended on position. From the summit of absolute authority, a Primarch owned the world's levers, and profit and power ultimately flowed from him. If the Legner family mishandled a venture and were swept away in the ensuing scramble, Doom would simply name their successor. He handed out rewards and appointments as he saw fit, selecting capable men to see his will done. Doom was no babysitter. He had no duty to hold the Legner's hand. The galaxy was harsh, survival of the fittest, a constant scramble for resources, and there was always a price to living. Doom made his move on the polished strategy board and, without looking up, asked Russ, "Why did you have the fleet stop at Fenris?" His gaze stayed on the pieces. "Keeping the Fenrisians away from technology and keeping them primitive. That was your idea, wasn't it?" Russ had once said, casually, that he had hidden the Empire from the mortals of Fenris, striving to preserve their wildness as much as possible. The Wolf King held that only those who had been tested by bitter weather and unforgiving landscapes could become true warriors. The legends themselves were carefully shaped, and the meeting of Russ and the Emperor was turned into an oral myth passed down through generations. To ordinary mortals, Russ, the Wolf King, had gone back to the Allfather's side, journeying to Valhalla to fight eternal wars at his lord's command. If the Fenrisians proved themselves in those trials, the Wolf King would dispatch envoys to lead the worthy to Valhalla among the stars, where they would continue to serve the Great Wolf. "That doesn't conflict, my brother," Doom said. Russ set a white piece on the board with deliberate slowness. "I never meant to overturn my own judgment and become a man who changes his mind from morning to night." His voice was rough with age and wind. "I will build a transit station on the far side of the Fenrisian star, hidden from the Fenrisian sight, veiled so completely that mortals will never find it." "My brother." Doom's fingers trembled as he moved a piece in reply. His weathered voice was hoarse. "As you said, ultimately we will fade. When the Great Crusade is finished, when Fenris has shed some of its barbarism and frost, that will be the moment." Russ's eyes lingered on the board, thinking as much of futures as of pieces. "Then the Fenrisians will accept a measure of civilization. A steady trade route will bring them prosperity and ease their lives." Doom nodded without speaking and continued the slow, ritual motions of the game. He had no real hope of victory. Russ's hand sealed the outcome. The Great Wolf was already arranging the future of Fenris, planning with the same care he applied to every campaign. The clack of pieces falling on the table punctuated their thoughts as they waited for the Mechanicus sage. 3 hours later, the sage returned to the Great Hall, entering cautiously. He carried news from Mars. "Esteemed Lord of the Null Stars, on behalf of Mars I offer you reparations." He spoke with extreme deference, his partially mechanical body bowed deeply, every word framed in the most humble tone. 20 mineral-rich worlds with their coordinates are at your disposal. Doom's reply was a single, flat, "Oh." The voice carried no inflection, deep as an abyss and impossible to read. The Adeptus Mechanicus had been careful. Their offer was precise and beyond reproach, giving him no opening to complain. The Mechanicus sage withdrew a data slate from the folds of his red robe and extended it on 2 metallic appendages. A handmaiden, bearing a tray, stepped forward and set the slate down on red satin. At that, the sage exhaled, relieved. The Primarch had accepted the gift, and the matter was settled. "I will not intrude further upon the 2 Primarchs' company. I shall take my leave," he added. "Summon me whenever you require instructions. I remain at the Adeptus Mechanicus outpost on the Imperial world." His tone stayed soft and deferential as he stepped back, eager to depart, though the practiced flattery kept spilling from his lips as he retreated. He gripped the forge-axe and moved like a shadow, careful not to make a sound that might draw the Primarch's attention. No further instructions came from the hall until he had slipped out of sight and rounded the corner. Once he was clear, the Mechanicus sage accelerated. The mechanical servos in his lower limbs hummed, and a brief, almost childlike pleasure crossed his features. 20 resource-rich worlds, Russ clicked, tongue clacking as he shook his head, eyes bright with envy. For the Space Wolves, whose holdings were shallow compared to the Empire's great domains, 20 productive planets were a fortune. To Nur it might have been negligible, but to the Wolf King it was enough to admire greedily. Doom merely smiled and said nothing, unmoved by Russ's reaction. He kept his attention on the new game unfolding. News of the Lord of the Stars' return had spread like wildfire, and after the Legner family's precedent, requests for audiences came flooding in. Rogue traders were especially eager. Each hoped for an invitation from the Lord of Nur to open fresh trade routes. In an age of human resurgence and grand voyages, securing a favored position meant the difference between obscurity and an enduring family legacy for 10,000 years. Doom rejected every petition to intervene and withdrew, letting the market compete on its own terms. The Legner family answered the opportunity. They put together a vast fleet, packed with food and trade goods, and sailed from Nur for Terra. 6 months later, a heavily damaged rogue trader armada limped back through the Nur gate, laden with wealth beyond imagination. Their voyage had been an odyssey, ambushed by human pirates, harried by Eldari raiders. And without the protection of the Space Wolves, the fleet's first convoys might well have been torn to pieces by plunderers. At the landing dock, Victoria Legner began emptying crate after crate of Imperial currency until the paving of the entire port was buried in coin. The sight of that gold sent the rogue traders into a frenzy. The tangible wealth proved irresistible. More ships signed on to the long-distance trading caravan. When money lay so openly before them, what were pirates by comparison? Victoria returned to see Doom and carried with her a personal letter from Malcador, an unusually warm expression of the Elder's gratitude. Russ read the note, handed it back to Doom, and a trace of surprise in his voice said, "That cunning old man rarely says thank you." Russ and Doom strolled through the Ring City at an easy pace, making their way toward the Stone Men's Gathering Hall. To Russ, Malcador had always been an odd old man, full of private habits, unpredictable in a temperament, quick to conceal his thoughts. He never seemed moved by the countless worlds seized by the expeditionary forces. If anything, he would scold the legions for their methods. Yet something as simple as sending food to Terra had reduced the Elder to tears. When Doom told him about the shipment, Malcador had been unexpectedly grateful, so grateful that he sat down and wrote a personal letter of thanks. Doom had not expected a reply, and the letter surprised him. He folded it carefully and tucked it away. The sincerity of Malcador's words had touched him more than he liked to admit. The old man had thanked Doom for what he'd done for the people of Terra. Russ watched him with a faint twitch at the corner of his mouth and said nothing as he stepped ahead. "Gather the supplies, load them onto the ships, and get them to Terra as quickly as you can," Doom said, catching up to Russ. "I'll be at the War College shortly. Sophia will take care of everything here." Russ only grunted in reply and kept walking, leaving Doom to set the plans in motion. The fleet's round trip took 6 months, and the food they carried was only a drop in the ocean compared to what the agricultural worlds produced. Crops on those worlds matured with astonishing speed. 6 months later, the Space Wolves fleet gathered at the Gate System Stargate, ready to leave the Null Stars. Russ stood on the dock in his Fenrisian runic armor, tall and immovable, bidding his brother farewell. In the year since they had arrived, the fleet had finished its upgrades and refits. The wolves had rested, replenished, and eager for the road. "Brother," Russ said quietly, "all meetings must end." Doom smiled, his face untouched by sorrow. "Parting is only for the sake of the next reunion," he replied, offering his brother a blessing. They clasped forearms in a warrior's grip and laughed together, the sound loud and warm. Russ shook his head with a triumphant grin. "Father calls me. He has met orcs in the void. I'm ready to send the greenskins to meet their Gork and Mork." During his time on Nur, Russ had not been idle. He had learned much. Of all the things he studied and understood, none gripped him as deeply as the nature of the orcs. The Wolf King could still hear his brother's warning. Orcs are a terrible force in the void, and one day they would crash into the Imperium. He had poured himself into Xenos lore so that when that day came, he could meet the greenskins with thunder and destroy them utterly. Doom could only rue the irony of fate. The Emperor had encountered orcs and called the Space Wolves to answer, and so Russ, calm and certain, gave a brief wave to his brother and without hesitation boarded the new Rafunkel. After watching the Space Wolves fleet unspool into the dark, Doom too stepped aboard the Royal Majesty and set his fleet on course for the Eastern Fringe star region. Note, the Wheel of Fire war timeline has been slightly adjusted. Chapter 238, The Power of Faith. Doom took a vastly enlarged fleet to the Imperium's Eastern Fringe, the largest star region under its control. The sector held hundreds of billions of stars, innumerable planets, and a bewildering variety of Xenos species. Reports had placed the Rangdan here, and Doom's objective for the campaign was simple: find them and destroy them. The Nur-led fleet launched swarms of scout vessels into the void, pushing ever deeper in search of any trace of the Rangdan. The work was slow and painstaking, but Doom would not accept his quarry remaining hidden. From 831 M30 to 832 M30, an entire year of searching, nothing was found. The Rangdan had vanished without a trace. Not a single eyewitness report surfaced, as if the terrifying race had never existed. The campaign was not entirely fruitless. In the course of their sweep, the Nur fleet exterminated 100 xenospecies and completely eradicated over 1,000 nascent species that showed intellectual potential. They also discovered dozens of human worlds and brought them back into the Imperium's fold. The edge of the Eastern Fringe was too far from the halo stars for Nur to manage directly, so the recovered worlds were most sensibly handed over to the Imperium. Open battles with humans were rare. At the sight of a fleet that blackened the sky, planetary rulers almost always moved quickly to sue for peace. Doom was not a rigid man. He would inspect each surrendered human world and test its local ruler. A capable ruler was allowed to remain, elevated to the status of a planetary governor of the Imperium. A mere occupant, however, earned Doom's cold scrutiny. His face would remain expressionless, but he would quietly dispatch the Alpha Legion to reshuffle the planet. By the Alpha Legion's practiced methods, revolution would be fomented, an engineered uprising that burned away the old corruption and darkness in a tide of blood and sacrifice, making room for a new order. Thus the Nur fleet cruised the void with clear purpose, to hunt the Rangdan, clear out Xenos, and seek out lost human worlds. "My lord," Sophia's voice was soft at his bedside as Doom woke. "The Master of Mankind has sent an astropathic message. Read it." The name snapped him fully awake. Doom swung his legs out of bed and stepped toward the wash basin. As hot water streamed over him, he watched the projection appear in Sophia's palm, a star coordinate. It pointed to the junction of the Storm Star region and the Eastern Fringe, a peripheral sector of the Fringe, where the Emperor's dream awaited him. Doom's heavy brows drew together. He ran through what the Master of Mankind had set in motion over the past year, trying to divine the purpose behind the summons. The Emperor had summoned Russ's Space Wolves to the Eastern Fringe, They were locked in a savage struggle with the orcs in the Firewheel subsector, a system of erratic planets, burning space dust, and violent ion and void storms. The orcs already held 20 worlds and were gathering to unleash a wog. The strategic simulations run by the Master of Mankind Horus and the War Council had warned that the Space Wolves might pay a heavy price if left to assault the orcs alone. To reduce that risk, they reached out to Ferrus Manus and requested that the Iron Hands lend support to the Wolves' campaign against the entrenched Greenskin hosts. At the outset of the war, the Space Wolves exceeded every expectation. Their professionalism and ferocity in the field impressed the Emperor and the rest of the High Command. Lemon Russ, the Wolf King, moved fast. He assembled a strike force and personally led the landing on the Orc world, baiting the enemy into an ambush with overwhelming force. In the end, Russ himself cleaved the Orc leader's head from his shoulders with his Kraken's tooth chainsword. With their war boss gone, 2 billion orcs immediately fractured into brutal infighting as rival contenders fought to claim leadership. The Wolfpack fleet seized the opportunity. Unleashing concentrated firepower, they destroyed the orc junk fleet, sealed off worlds where the greenskins were trapped, and cut down the orcs' most effective fighting units. Over the course of the year-long campaign, the Space Wolves leveraged their fleet advantage and kept up relentless aerial assaults. Time and again, they eliminated newly risen war bosses and steadily wore the orcs down, grinding the threat back into disorder. On worlds where the orcs had been driven to extinction, Russ ordered the Adeptus Mechanicus to scorch the soil with plasma, so nothing could burrow back up. The Master of Mankind watched that professionalism and stayed only 3 months in the Firewheel subsector before moving on. The War Council estimated it would take the Space Wolves at least 3 years to root out the remaining orc nests. The Master could not afford such a delay, so he left and continued his search for the Primarchs. Before departing, he presented Russ with a golden spear, called the Spear of Dionysus, and praised the Space Wolves for their bravery and judgment. His Royal Majesty will proceed to the rendezvous point. The Nur fleet will continue its mission, searching for traces of the Rangdan, he announced. Doom curled his lips into a smile. After a moment's thought, he allowed the fleet to carry on with its sweep while he slipped off to meet the Master of Mankind. By his reckoning, there would be no accidents on the way. In fact, the Master had likely found a new brother. The two parties were not far apart, both hovering along the edge of the eastern fringe star region. With the Rangdan currently untraceable, Doom was free to detach from the fleet for a time and go meet a returning brother. The battle barge Royal Majesty powered up its Jeller field, slipped into the warp, and set a direct course for the Master of Mankind. When the ship dropped out of the warp into an unfamiliar star system, the Master of Mankind had already been waiting. His voice, vast and commanding, filled every mind aboard. "Prepare yourselves. We are landing on Nocturne." He did not bother with holographic feeds. The radiance of his psychic presence alone compelled mortals to obey. Doom, however, could not receive that psychic transmission and leaned toward a nearby custodian. "What did he say?" he asked. "Prepare to land on Nocturne with him." Odysseus, shield captain of the custodians, replied at once. 1,000 custodians, those who had not returned to Terra after the Rangdan War, still stood with Doom. They had their own reasons for remaining. The Rangdan had not been fully eradicated, and their duty was not yet done. Doom had seen it coming long ago. The custodians were using the mission as an excuse to push further into the stars and to keep him under close watch. He understood them well and said nothing. As the Master of Mankind's personal guard, the custodians were supposed to return to Terra after their duties and resume protecting their liege. But everyone also knew the unspoken truth. Who in the real galaxy could seriously threaten the Master? A portion of the custodians had been seconded to oversee the creation of Doom's Marines. Doom himself traveled with 1,000 of them. In addition to the garrison around the Imperial Palace, the Master kept 1,000 warriors at his immediate side. If anyone could cut through 1,000 custodians and reach the Master, then adding more guards would be meaningless. What worried the custodians was not arithmetic, but possibility. They genuinely believed this warrior king might be the only being capable of endangering the master of mankind. That was why they shadowed him so closely. The Lord of the Doom Marines was a terrifying figure. Psychic powers seemed to have no effect on him, and his skill in close combat was devastating. He could beat the Phoenix of the Purple Court so mercilessly it retched bile. Rumor held that he wielded a divine blade. When the master of mankind once tried to lift it, the weapon burned him, leaving a permanent scar across his palm. All of this made Odysseus uneasy. If the master were ever deprived of his psychic gifts and had to rely solely on hand-to-hand fighting, he would be vulnerable. Worse, the Doom Marines themselves were not ordinary Astartes. They were something higher, an altogether different order of warrior. If any of the Primarchs turned hostile, they could close on him in an instant, overwhelming even the master of mankind. The master had once told the custodians not to fear the Doom Marines, calling them the most dependable warriors. But as his bodyguards, the custodians could not afford complacency. They had to remain constantly alert, a living barrier between danger and their charge. Doom gave a small, understanding nod, then moved toward the shuttle bay to meet the master of mankind. Two immense ships crouched in the star's shadow, holding themselves out of the void so the people of Nocturne would not see them. Inside the small, hushed cabin of a custodian shuttle, the master of mankind waited, dressed in nothing more than a simple robe. When Doom entered, the master of mankind reached out with his mind and guided the shuttle toward Nocturne, a silent command to go greet his son. Doom took a seat, his tiger-like eyes narrowing as something in the master struck him as wrong. "Your power has grown stronger," he said. He could feel the master's psychic radiance more clearly than before, sharper, brighter, without the usual threat of exhaustion. The master of mankind shouldered the burden of the Astronomicon, the beacon that guided the Imperial fleet. That duty burned his psychic energy every moment. Being so far from Terra should have made that drain worse, dimming the light around him. Instead, the aura had not faded. If anything, it had intensified. There was no trace of weariness in the master's face, only a vivid, almost restless vitality. Faith. The master of mankind's voice was spare. Beneath the aureate light, the middle-aged man gave a helpless, bitter smile. As the Great Crusade marched on, and the Imperium's borders spread, mortals began to answer me with gratitude and worship, he said. Despite my own edicts against such things, despite ordering the 17th Legion to root out superstition, reverence gathered around me like stars. I tore down temples, burned scriptures and heretical texts, and yet I have become what they pray to. The Adeptus Mechanicus calls me the Omnissiah. Some of the faith their rites create flows to me as well. When he finished, he drew a long breath, sank back into his chair, and fell silent. He felt as if he had been speaking forever, perhaps even saying too much. "No, that's not it." Doom's tone cut through the stillness. His expression hardened, a cold, dangerous light coming into his eyes that made the master of mankind shiver. "I see divinity." Doom's most hypersensitive, most hated reflex had been triggered by the master of mankind. 239. Nocturne Doom's gaze cut through the psychic haze and caught a trace of divinity, a faint glimmer of light, paradoxically set within an absolute, unblemished black. It was a tiny thing, small and precise, yet Doom felt at once that it carried a dark, ravenous power, one that seemed capable of devouring everything it touched. "You will explain yourself," he said. His voice was cold as frost, and the temperature in the cockpit seemed to drop with it. The Custodes' superhuman bodies stiffened at the Primarch's tone, fingers clenched reflexively around guardian spears. For an instant, instinct won out over oath. The sudden, animal urge to preserve themselves flashed through them, and not from their duty, but from fear, a realization that filled them with fresh shame. Contradiction tore at the Custodes. The very warning in their Primarch's presence had, for a single heartbeat, overridden the code they lived by. They were left afraid, not of the command, but of their own inadequacy to keep the master of mankind safe. The warrior king stood before them, and the Custodes tightened their grips on their weapons, the hard, cold steel a talisman against the weakness stirring in their souls. The Emperor fell briefly silent, as he always did. Doom's eyes were sharp and unhidden. He wanted an answer, one that might convince the Godslayer. The air in the cockpit seemed to drop to freezing. Even the Emperor's warm radiance could not thaw the frozen heartbeats that held them all. Divinity comes from worship, the Emperor began slowly after a long pause, explaining the source of his own claimed divinity. Human imagination, when fixed on what it worships, always gilds and enlarges. It fills in the blanks with perfect, magnificent definitions. The word God itself comes from the religious practices of old Terra, he continued. It is a product of our imaginations. A savior becomes a god. A powerful person becomes a god. The brilliant become gods, and even the vile are made gods in the eyes of their followers. Whatever the reason, whether it fits human reason or not, the image of whatever people worship bends toward divinity. Many within the Imperium truly believe, that I am a god, the master of mankind said, weariness and resignation in his face. I have devoted myself to stamping out superstition. I even deployed an entire legion for that purpose, and yet I have never succeeded in eradicating ignorance and the tendency to deify individuals. Compared to the cold, unfeeling definitions of the imperial truth, which demands emotionless fidelity, it is far easier and far more vivid for people to fashion an idol they can carry in their hearts. Doom listened without interrupting. When the Emperor finished, he spoke simply, asking the middle-aged man, whose divinity was just beginning to show, one blunt question: Are you a god? For a psyker of the Emperor's power, the weight of belief often mattered more than any objective fact. Subjective conviction could create realities where reason could not. If he wanted to become a god, all he would have to do was shrug off his burdens and wait, cultivate the conditions for divinity over time. He would not have to carry the fate of humanity on his shoulders or perform empty acts in its name. The Emperor was already beyond mortality, untouched by birth, aging, illness, or death. If he renounced his last traces of humanity and embraced his own divinity, godhood would be easy. I am not a god. For the first time, the Emperor's august features betrayed a raw, unmistakable disgust. The word God seemed to repulse him. His refusal was absolute, delivered without hesitation, as if drawing a firm line in the air. Doom watched him without expression. He believed the Emperor's words, but he did not trust his humanity. Subjective motives could change. The Emperor who swore he was not a god now might, in time, choose or be forced into it. Let time examine the truth. Let the future decide whether that promise held. Their exchange was short and perilous. In a few spare minutes, he had touched on divinity and the mechanics of becoming a god, and left the rest to the slow, impartial verdict of time. It was odd that the two of them, both more than capable of becoming gods in the real universe, shared a deep aversion to divinity. They understood the price. Gods, they knew, were not noble beings but puppets animated by godhood and power, corrupted, capricious, and ultimately self-interested. They might pity and cherish some, scorn and abandon others. They schemed and attacked one another over differences in power, no more dignified than mortal court intrigues. A brief exchange ended, and silence settled over the shuttle. The taut edge between the two great beings relaxed a little. The Custodes shuttle flew true and steady, its systems efficient, its pilot eager to put distance between them and the suffocating presence that filled the cabin. Doom lifted his left hand. An image bloomed from his arm guard, a holographic feed streaming real-time telemetry from the Royal Majesty. Their destination was a dead world, a crust of constant volcanoes, the surface a living flow of magma, as if one of the molten hells from ancient legend had been set in orbit. According to Sophia's scans and calculations, the dead world called Nocturne swung close to its massive moon every 15 years. The two bodies' tidal pull set the planet's entire volcanic system ablaze. Doom's eyes widened in awe. He found himself marveling again at the raw mechanics of the universe. The moon was enormous. The fact that it didn't smash into Nocturne during each close pass was almost miraculous. "We can only take you this far," the Custodes pilot said, the shuttle hovering just above the ash layer. Every 15 years the planet erupted in cataclysm, volcanoes belching so much ash that it built thick atmospheric blankets. Aircraft had trouble penetrating them. A single miscalculation could send a shuttle tumbling into the inferno below. The Emperor merely nodded. He sent a brief psychic instruction to the Custodes, and the rear hatch slid open. A gust of wind rushed into the cabin, carrying the sharp, sulphurous tang of volcanic smoke. Doom rose without a word, moved to the open doorway, and peered down into the rolling curtains of ash, black clouds split by flickers of lightning. "Let's go." The Emperor wrapped his long robe around himself, a halo of psychic radiance flickering from his shoulders, and stepped out of the golden shuttle as if setting foot on a balcony. Doom could not be touched by psychic influence. The Emperor's light could not lift or guide him, so Doom would have to make his own way down. Serene, almost bored, Doom leaped from the cabin and dove into the void. The air screamed past him as he fell. His left arm bracer pulsed, and a round shield winked into being from a pocket dimension beneath his feet. He did not use it to cushion the impact. He used it as a platform, something solid to press against the air and tear a path through the choking dust. Without that brief shelter, wind and grit would have forced into his mouth and lungs. He planted his feet on the shield and drove it down, literally punching a hole through the storm of particles. Lightning flared around him as he plummeted from 10,000 meters, an iron-smooth fall broken by controlled violence. Beside him, the Emperor descended in perfect sync, riding his psychic light like a golden tide. Each used his own method. Their trajectories matched, the shuttle's ramp to Nocturne made irrelevant. The impact was less a landing than a verdict. A muffled thunderclap swallowed the sound of metal and stone giving way. Dust roared outward. Doom struck like a falling god. The ground exploded beneath him and the Emperor's radiance, and where they hit the surface a crater opened, black-rimmed and smoking, like where a meteor had split the world. He shrugged off his cloak and shook the dust free, the hem the only part that came away slightly soiled, then casually picked up his shield. Doom took in the scene, a wasteland of volcanoes and rivers of molten rock, and he stood and a black expanse of polished obsidian. "Go that way," the Emperor said as he floated down, pointing. "I sense his presence." Doom nodded and without a word moved in the indicated direction. Shield in his left hand, super shotgun at his hip in his right, he kept his eyes sweeping the horizon. In a low voice he warned, "The local fauna aren't friendly," as he loaded the shotgun, but he never slowed. The Emperor said nothing more. He raised a hand, and a shaft of golden light lanced from his fingertips into the river of magma beside the obsidian plain. The molten rock hissed and boiled. Steam screamed upward as something enormous clawed its way out. A colossal lizard-like behemoth, straight out of old Terra, heaved itself from the lava. Its massive body was sheathed in heat-proof scales, built to survive and lie motionless in simmering magma, waiting for prey to come close. Doom didn't hesitate. He sprinted across the black expanse of the obsidian lake, planted his foot on the carcass of a magma lizard, and used it to launch himself over a 100-meter-wide river of molten rock, landing on solid ground beyond. From the magma, a host of strange creatures erupted, scaled scorpions and massive fire-breathing lizards, their crimson eyes fixed hungrily on him. Doom ignored them. He moved so quickly that he vanished from the native sight, leaving only baffled monsters standing in the glowing flow, exchanging looks as if they had all imagined him. Above him, the Emperor hovered, suspended by his powers. He spared Doom a great deal of trouble, calling out directions and steering him away from pockets and islands of magma. Doom still disliked psychic abilities, but even he had to admit that when they were used well, they could be incredibly convenient. Together, they pushed on, racing across volcanic flats and fields of cooled obsidian toward their goal. After 3 hours of hard travel, Doom and the Emperor reached a mountaintop and stood there, looking out over the distant highlands. They finally saw a human settlement, a town perched on high ground, with fertile fields around it where unfamiliar crops grew. The outskirts were alive with activity, dark-skinned humans arming themselves and fighting a swarm of attackers. Among the defenders stood a giant, almost 6 meters tall, swinging a massive hammer and crushing the nimble alien assailants. Without any need for explanation, both of them immediately recognized him as someone they had lost, brother, son, or some combination of the two. Doom stood on a large boulder, eyes locked on the town. "Do they need our help?" he asked. He already knew who the attackers were. The Dark Eldar, the depraved remnant of the Eldar who had not repented after their fall. Naked Eldar females, which moved with lethal grace through the fray, cutting down humans with poisoned daggers. "We need to watch," the Emperor said. Sparks flickered at his fingertips as he wove a shimmering barrier around them, hiding their presence. We must examine his heart. The amniotic pod carrying the 18th Primarch tore free of the warp and crashed down on the rim of a volcano on Nocturne. A lone blacksmith, who had ventured into the volatile region during a lull to harvest precious minerals, found it. The pod lay near a river of boiling lava, and something enormous stirred beneath the scalding surface. Sensing the danger, the blacksmith didn't hesitate. He plunged forward and snatched the naked infant from the edge of the flow just as a great maw broke the surface, hungry for what lay there. Carrying the child back to his town, the blacksmith named him Vulcan after an old legend of the god of fire and forge, a name that hinted at the man the child might become. Vulcan grew with terrifying speed. Nocturne's harsh environment stripped away his infant pallor and black pupils. His skin darkened and took on a peculiar, toughened texture. His eyes flamed blood red. He became enormous, a living anvil of muscle with skin like burned iron and eyes like burning stars, a figure that inspired fear as easily as awe. Vulcan was, by nature, gentle. He followed his adoptive father into the forge, learning the craft of a blacksmith, and he took to it with the same ease that marked everything about him. He learned fast, astonishingly fast. Within months his skill had overtaken his father's. The young man's hands shaped metal with a confidence and precision that left the old smith both proud and quietly awed. At first, the townspeople were afraid of him. Vulcan's size and unfamiliar presence made him seem like something out of a nightmare, and the local folk kept their distance. But time and everyday life softened their fear. As they watched him work, their apprehension turned to admiration. His tools were not only tough and perfectly made, they were beautiful, almost like sculptures. People bought them not merely to use, but to display, kept on shelves and in parlors so everyone could admire them rather than wear them down with labor. For a long while life settled into a peaceful routine. The forge rang out its steady rhythm, customers came and left, and the town felt secure and comfortable. Then one day, that quiet was shattered. A group of uninvited guests arrived, and the mood changed all at once. Vulcan's adoptive father returned from the square with fear in his eyes and called his son home. "Close the doors and windows," he told him, voice tight. It wasn't just their house. Everywhere was the same. The usually busy streets stood empty. Shutters were drawn, shops closed, and people cowered inside their homes, trembling. The town that had grown used to Vulcan's gentle presence now waited in dread for whatever had come to disturb their peace. Vulcan stood there, bewildered, staring at his father, who trembled slightly as if every word weighed on him. Around them, the neighborhood was tense. Vulcan could hear neighbors muttering and grinding their teeth in fear. "What's wrong, father?" he asked. The blacksmith swallowed and told his son why the town had fallen into such a state. Nocturne suffered plenty of natural disasters, he said, but the worst threat came from people beyond their world. Periodic raids by alien, almost human invaders. These raiders didn't just steal what they wanted, they took pleasure in killing, in torturing and humiliating the townsfolk. At first, pockets of the town fought back. People armed themselves however they could, crude spears, blacksmith-forged blades, and tried to drive the invaders off. But the aliens were fast and merciless. Any resistance only brought more brutality. The raiders would descend, wrapped with bloodlust, and slaughter anyone who stood against them. The cries of the dying and the victorious shouts of the attackers echoed through Nocturne's streets. As the years wore on, the fighting faded. The price of resistance had been too high. Now, when the raiders came, the town shut down, doors bolted, shutters closed, and people cowered inside, praying the invaders would pass them by and spare them yet another night of terror. People had lost their courage, huddled like livestock waiting for the slaughterer to choose, too afraid even to cry out. After telling them the whole story, the blacksmith put a hand on his son's knee and urged him to hide. Raiders would single out anything unusual. Vulcan's existence would make him a prize to be stolen. Vulcan's jaw tightened. He dropped to one knee beside his father. "We should fight," he said. "A victim's cowardice will never win an abuser's pity." "Vulcan," the blacksmith began, his voice low and rough as hammered iron. But Vulcan spoke over him, eyes burning. "Father, If there's any reason for my being the way I am, it has to be for days like this. He rose without another word, grabbed a massive hammer from the weapons rack, and set his shoulders as if ready to crack the world itself. He had long known he was different. Years before, at his father's urging, they had gone back to the place where the boy had first been found. They had smashed through the black glass of cooled lava, dug out the obsidian lake, and discovered a ruined amniotic pod, its casing cracked and scorched. Stenciled across it in faded official paint were the characters, X6. It hit Vulcan like a physical blow. He'd been bred, one of at least 17 like him. He tightened his grip on the warhammer. Understanding flared in his crimson eyes. Perhaps this power, this purpose bleeding through his bones, had been given to him to protect humanity. Son, I'm with you. The blacksmith felt the resolve in his child and set down his apron. He picked up a longsword, ready to fight by Vulcan's side. You don't have to, Vulcan started, anxiety knotting his voice. He didn't know how strong the enemy would be and didn't want his father risking his life. The old man cut him off with a quiet, iron smile. If you have the will to resist, then I have the right and the duty to resist with you. His determination was impossible to ignore. Vulcan nodded without another word and tightened his grip on the hammer. The blacksmith was like an anvil, stubborn, unyielding, weathered by time, yet immovable in his decisions. Father and son took their weapons, opened the door, and stepped out. Their heavy footsteps drew looks. From shadowed window corners, people peered out and saw a huge, dark figure in the street. The weapon in the giant's hand left no doubt. Vulcan would not go quietly. Once men took up arms, there was no middle ground, only life or death. Maybe it was the way he carried himself, or the certainty in his stance, but more people spilled from their rooms with weapons in hand. From the street to the city gate, a steady crowd gathered around Vulcan, silent, except for exchanged looks that mirrored the same resolve. From the distant fields came high, manic cackles. At last, the waiting folk saw the legendary raiders. Tall, lithe figures wove through the crops, surprisingly humanoid women, naked except for the war paint streaked across their bodies. Their forms were largely human, but more delicate and graceful, their ears long and pointed. They moved with an unnerving, unnatural speed. Their slender faces were marked in ritual paint, their eyes glittered with hunger for blood, and cruel smiles tugged at their lips. When the witches caught sight of the black, tower-like figure at the head of the crowd, excitement brightened their faces. Bring that prey back to Kamara. I want to enjoy him thoroughly. The raiders spat the words in the Eldar tongue, and the lead witch licked her lips, eyes gleaming with hunger. Faced with the alien onslaught, Vulcan planted both hands on his hammer, and felt something clear and simple, weakness. He had long thought his power limited, unable to keep everyone safe against foes like these. Now a small, steady smile touched his face, the satisfaction of finally being able to protect them. Why was he smiling? The witch wondered as she hurled herself into the fray. She had seen countless humans, but never one so calm. There was no fear in that smile, only a hard, almost tender contentment. In that instant, the depraved witch understood what the ma-en meant. Vulcan stepped forward. His immense bulk moved like an unstoppable war engine. Each footfall shuddered through the primeval soil. For the Dark Eldar, there was only a blur. Then the black shape was upon them. The broad face of the warhammer slammed against them, and everything went dark. The Eldar moved like phantoms, swift, graceful, almost toy-like against ordinary humans, who fought and died in humiliating futility. But the man standing before them was no ordinary soldier. He was a Primarch, a demigod forged by the Emperor, the mightiest being in the material universe. The raiders were quick, but to Vulcan they were no different from mere mortals. He swung his warhammer. The blow landed with a sickening, glorious thud. The lithe witch who met it was shattered as if swatted from the air. The hammer's head came away streaked with crimson, the Eldar reduced to pulp. Before the witches could comprehend their sister's death, Vulcan had already thrown himself into their ranks. His hammer became a blur, and where it fell, bodies were crushed and torn. By the time friend and foe alike could react, he had cut down many of the invaders, leaving mangled flesh in his wake. The surviving witches screamed, part grief, part outrage, feeling their sister's life snatched and her soul devoured by the Dark Prince. The humans, meanwhile, roared, raised their weapons, and closed around the damned aliens. Under Vulcan's command, the human troops surged forward, breaking into small warbands to encircle and cut down the raiders. His presence lit a fire in them. Where they had once seen invincibility in the Xenos, they now saw something to be fought and beaten. Vulcan led the charge, sweeping across the battlefield like a black whirlwind and shattering the witch raiding party. Even the quick-eyed Eldar, whose reflexes could read many of a mortal's moves, had no chance against a Primarch. Each blow from his massive hammer landed with crushing, instantaneous force. Contact meant nothing but death. With every strike, his confidence grew. Alien blood spattered his dark face as the merciful Primarch let loose a terrible fury. He reserved pity for mankind alone. To his eyes, the Xenos deserved no quarter. Within moments, half the witches were down, and only a handful remained to stand against his berserker onslaught. A high, ragged cry rose in the Eldar tongue, an order to flee. The human before them was simply too terrifying. The Dark Eldar began to fall back. Vulcan did not need to understand their words. The frantic, uncoordinated motion of their retreat told him all he needed to know. They were running. Vulcan stepped forward again, his bulk blotting out the light and casting a dark shadow over the terrified Eldar. With one enormous hand, he seized a naked witch and drove her to the ground, holding her there without ceremony. Vulcan was a Primarch, born to command and to see the shape of battle. Even in the quiet hours at his forge, he retained an uncanny grasp of conflict and morale. He understood that the people of Nocturne needed more than fury. They needed a rallying victory to rekindle the courage of humans who had lost the will to resist. A living, captured alien would be a potent symbol, proof that the old fears could be faced and overcome, and that a new beginning was possible.